Hey there. Tonight, we're going to explore why love was, shall we say, disgusting in medieval times. Wrap yourself in a blanket and get comfortable as we gently peel back the layers of myth to find the harsh, uncomfortable, and frankly bizarre truths of medieval romance. If you feel like it, leave a comment. Let us know where you're listening from. It's always so interesting to see where our fellow history travelers are settling in for the night. And if you enjoy these calm historical journeys, perhaps consider subscribing to the channel. We're not going where you think. This isn't just about the lack of plumbing. It's about the very soul of what they called love. So, just close your eyes and imagine yourself for a moment, not in a grand ballroom, but in the cold, damp reality of a world lit only by fire and faith. The air in here is thick with the smell of wood smoke, damp wool, and something vaguely animal. It's the scent of life, unfiltered. You can feel a persistent draft snaking its way through the gaps in the stone walls, a reminder that true comfort is a luxury few will ever know. This is the world we're stepping into, a world where the fairy tales we've been told about knights and fair maidens begin to fray at the edges, revealing a much rougher, more complicated tapestry beneath. We think of medieval romance, and our minds conjure images of chivalry, of knights in shining armor, pledging their undying devotion to a beautiful lady in a tower. We see vibrant tournaments, hear the soft strum of a lute, playing a ballad of true love. But this is a fantasy, a story polished over centuries, like a river stone that has lost all its sharp edges. The reality was something else entirely. It was a landscape of emotion so foreign to our own that to call it love feels like a category error. It was often a performance, a transaction, a form of elegant suffering, and sometimes a kind of beautiful, devotional violence. The love we cherish today, a partnership of equals, built on mutual affection and understanding, would have been seen as naive, foolish, and perhaps even dangerous. It was a private indulgence in a world that demanded public, strategic alliances. So tonight, let's just drift back together, past the glittering mirage of Camelot, and feel our way through the strange and often brutal emotional world of the Middle Ages. We'll see that what they called romance was frequently a tangled knot of ownership, duty, spiritual anxiety, and a profound, almost worshipful obsession with death. It's a darker story than the one we're used to, but it's a more human one, too, full of contradictions and strange, fragile beauties. Forget the fairy tale. The truth is far more interesting and, in its own way, far more compelling. Let the sounds of the modern world fade away, and let the quiet, crackling fire of a medieval hearth pull you deeper into the past. There is no need to follow every word. Just let the story wash over you, a gentle current to carry you off to sleep. We have a long journey ahead of us, through halls of power and humble peasant huts, through the rigid doctrines of the church and the wild, untamed passions of forbidden love poetry. We'll begin with the most famous, and perhaps the most misunderstood, of all medieval romantic inventions, the strange and painful art of courtly love. It was a game played by the rich and powerful, a game where the only way to win was to never, ever get what you wanted. It was a beautiful, elaborate cage for the heart, and it set the stage for everything else that was to follow. A performance of suffering that shaped the very idea of love for centuries. The concept of courtly love is a strange, shimmering thing, born in the sun-drenched courts of southern France in the 12th century. It feels like a dream, a literary fantasy, and in many ways, it was. But it was a dream that had very real consequences. At its heart was a paradox. True, noble love was, by definition, unattainable. It was the love of a knight, a man of lower social standing, for a high-born, usually married, noblewoman. He was her vassal, her servant, in love as he was in feudal politics. His entire being was dedicated to her, but this dedication could never be consummated. To do so would be to vulgarize it, to bring this sublime, spiritual connection down to the grubby level of ordinary marriage. So instead, the love was expressed through service, through poetry, through secret glances across a crowded hall, and most importantly, through suffering. The suffering was the proof. The deeper the knight's anguish, the more sleepless nights he spent, the more he physically wasted away from the sheer force of his longing, the more noble and true his love was considered to be. It was a love that found its ultimate expression not in joy, but in a state of perpetual, agonizing desire. Imagine a young knight. Let's call him Gilhim. He is landless, the younger son of a minor baron. His only assets, his horse, his armor, and his skill with a lance. He arrives at the court of a powerful duke, hoping to make his name and his fortune. And there he sees her, the Duchess, a woman of immense power and beauty, utterly beyond his reach. She is his lord's wife. To even think of her is a form of treason. But under the new rules of this fashionable game of courtly love, this forbidden desire is not a sin. It is the highest calling. So Gilhim dedicates himself to her. He wears her colors, a silk ribbon she once dropped, tied to his helmet when he rides in the tournament. He fights with the fury of 10 men, not for money or fame, but for the hope that she might be watching from the stands, that she might offer him a single, small, approving nod. When he is wounded, the pain is a sweet offering to her. Back in the castle, he stays up late, composing clumsy but heartfelt poems, comparing her eyes to stars, her hair to spun gold. He can't sleep. He barely eats. His friends see him growing pale and thin, and they don't worry. They admire him. He has been struck by amor, the noble sickness of love. He is performing his role perfectly. And the Duchess? She is expected to play her part, too. She must remain distant, cool, imperious. She is the star, the unobtainable prize. If she were to give in, to show him pity or affection, she would ruin the game. She would lower herself, and in doing so, invalidate the very suffering that gives his love its value. Her role is to be a remote goddess, a living embodiment of an ideal that can be worshipped but never touched. It was a system of emotional self-torture elevated to the level of high art. Manuals were written about it, like Andreas Capellanus's The Art of Courtly Love, which reads like a bizarre psychological textbook, codifying the rules of this painful game. It lists the symptoms of the true lover: a constant pallor, a racing heart at the thought of the beloved, insomnia, loss of appetite. It was a recognized medical condition, love sickness, and it could be fatal. But what a noble way to die. This wasn't just happening in poems. It was influencing real behavior among the elite. It created a culture where feelings were not something to be shared and reciprocated, but something to be hoarded, cultivated in secret, and displayed through elaborate, often painful, performances. It was, in a way, the medieval equivalent of a highly curated social media profile, where everyone is presenting an idealized version of their emotional life, full of beautiful, tragic longing. The irony, of course, is that this whole elaborate fantasy of chaste, spiritual devotion was taking place in a world of brutal political marriages, where the very Duchess being worshipped as a goddess had likely been married off as a teenager in a deal to secure a border or acquire a vineyard. Courtly love was a beautiful, poetic escape valve for the stifling reality of aristocratic life. It gave knights a noble purpose and ladies a sense of power and desirability that their real lives, as political pawns, often lacked. It was a gorgeous, glittering lie, but a lie they all desperately wanted to believe. And as we will see, the echoes of this performance, this idea that love must involve a degree of pain and unattainability, would ripple outwards, infecting every other form of relationship in this strange and contradictory world. The suffering was the point. The performance of courtly love, this delicate and agonizing dance of unrequited desire, was a luxury item, an emotional sport for the 1% of the medieval world. For the vast majority of people, and even for the nobility when it came down to brass tacks, love had nothing to do with longing glances or secret poems. It had to do with contracts, land, livestock, and the cold, hard calculus of survival and advancement. Marriage was not the culmination of a romance. It was a business transaction, and often it looked a lot like what we would today call legalized human trafficking, all blessed and sanctioned by the church. Imagine you are a father, a powerful baron with a sprawling estate and a strategically important castle. You also have a daughter, age 12. To you, she is not primarily a child to be nurtured and loved into adulthood. She is your single greatest asset. Her future marriage is not a matter for her heart to decide. It is a critical move on the geopolitical chessboard of your region. Her hand in marriage can secure a fragile peace with a neighboring rival, absorb a smaller fiefdom into your own, or gain you a powerful ally in the king's court. So you begin negotiations. You send envoys to the court of another lord, a man you may have fought against just a few years prior. The letters that go back and forth are not filled with pleasantries about the potential happiness of the young couple. They are filled with clauses and subclauses. They read like a corporate merger agreement. Your envoy will argue that your daughter's dowry should include the southern pasture lands, 20 head of cattle, and a payment of 500 silver marks. The other lord's envoy will counter that this is too steep, that his son brings to the marriage a direct connection to the royal family, and therefore the dowry should be larger. They will haggle over every last acre, every last cow. The children themselves are barely mentioned, except as the vessels through which this transfer of property will occur. Let's call your daughter Isabel. At 12, she is on the cusp of womanhood, but she is still a child. She spends her days with her governess, learning needlepoint and perhaps a little bit of reading, mostly religious texts. One day, you summon her to the Great Hall. Her future husband's family has sent a portrait of their son, a boy of 14 she has never met. He is pale and serious in the painting. She is told that she is betrothed to him. The contract has been signed. It is a legally binding document. To break it would be a matter of great dishonor and could even lead to war. Isabel has no say in this. Her opinion is not sought, nor is it considered relevant. Her duty is to her family, to her lineage. Her personal feelings are an extravagance that no one can afford. The idea that she might object, that she might have a preference for someone else, perhaps a handsome squire she has seen in the courtyard, is not just ignored. It is seen as a sign of a dangerous willfulness. If a young couple did happen to fall in love and wish to marry, their families would often view it with deep suspicion. Love was seen as a volatile, irrational emotion. It was fickle. It could lead to foolish decisions. A marriage based on such a flimsy foundation was considered a bad risk. A marriage based on the strategic merger of two estates, however, was built on something solid, something real. Once the contract is finalized, Isabel might be sent away to live in the household of her future in-laws. She leaves behind everything she has ever known, her mother, her home, the very landscape of her childhood, and travels for weeks on dusty, dangerous roads to a new castle, a new country, where she might not even speak the language. She is now a stranger in a strange land, her value entirely dependent on the dowry she brings and her future ability to produce a male heir. She is a living, breathing piece of the treaty. The wedding ceremony itself is less a celebration of love and more a public ratification of the contract. The priest will bless the union, of course, but the most important part of the day, legally speaking, might happen that night. The bedding ceremony, where the young, often terrified, couple is escorted to their marriage bed by a crowd of drunken relatives and witnesses, was not just a ribald custom. It was a crucial step in verifying the consummation of the marriage, thereby making the transfer of property legally irreversible. This was the stark reality of aristocratic marriage. It was a system that deliberately and systematically bypassed the concept of personal choice and romantic love. A woman was an entry on a ledger, a walking dowry, her womb an essential part of a dynastic strategy. It was a cold, pragmatic business, and in this environment, the flowery, impossible ideals of courtly love begin to make more sense. They were a necessary fantasy, a way to inject some poetry and meaning into a system that was, at its core, profoundly unromantic. It was a way of pretending that the heart still had a role to play, even when everyone knew the real decisions were being made in the counting house. The world of the medieval peasant was, in many ways, a universe away from the perfumed courts and cold stone castles of the nobility. For the vast majority of people, life was tied to the soil, to the turning of the seasons, and to the relentless demands of agricultural labor. Love and marriage in this world were not governed by the poetic suffering of courtly love or the grand strategic alliances of barons. They were governed by something far more immediate and stark: survival. Yet, even here, in the smoky, one-room hut of a farming family, the idea of marrying for love as we know it would have seemed a strange and risky proposition. Let's imagine a young man named Thomas, living in a small village in the heart of England. He is a villain, a serf, legally bound to the land owned by the local lord. He cannot leave the village, he cannot change his profession, and he cannot marry without his lord's permission. His life is a cycle of plowing, planting, and harvesting. When Thomas thinks about a wife, his first thoughts are not of her beauty or the sound of her laughter. His thoughts are practical, grimly so. Can she work? Is she strong? Can she manage a household, bake bread, brew the weak ale that is safer to drink than the local water, spin wool, mend clothing, tend a garden, and, most importantly, bear children who will survive to help in the fields? A wife is not a romantic partner. She is an essential economic partner. A man cannot run a farm holding on his own, just as a woman cannot. Marriage is the creation of a functional economic unit, the most basic building block of the village community. Thomas might have a preference. Perhaps he fancies Edith, the baker's daughter. He might try to catch her eye at church on Sunday, the one day of rest. They might exchange a few shy words by the village well. This small element of personal choice was often more present among the peasantry than the nobility, simply because their marriages had no political consequences. The Lord didn't care who Thomas married, as long as Thomas paid a small fee, the merche, for the permission to marry, and as long as his new wife was from the same manor. The Lord didn't want to lose a valuable worker to another estate, but even this choice was heavily constrained. Thomas needs a wife now. His father is growing old, and the work is too much. Edith's father, the baker, will be looking at Thomas just as pragmatically. Does Thomas have a good strip of land to farm? Is he a hard worker, or is he known for spending too much time at the alehouse? Does his family have a good reputation in the village? The dowry in this context is not a chest of gold or a deed to a forest. It might be a single cow, a few pots and pans, a good spinning wheel, or a flock of chickens. These are not trivial things. A cow could mean the difference between sustenance and starvation. These were serious negotiations between families, a miniature version of the aristocratic horse trading. The wedding, when it happens, is a simple affair. A priest says the words, perhaps in the church porch rather than at the high altar. There is a small celebration, a village feast if the families can afford it, with everyone contributing what they can. And then, it is back to work. The new couple, perhaps barely more than teenagers, now share a cramped space, often with parents, siblings, and maybe even a few animals sheltering from the cold. There is no privacy. The romantic ideal of a couple building a life together in their own private world is a modern fantasy. Their life is utterly public, lived in the constant presence of the community. Love, in this context, might grow. It might blossom out of shared hardship, mutual reliance, and the quiet comfort of familiarity. A husband and wife who have survived a harsh winter together, who have nursed a sick child through a fever, who have worked side by side in the fields for 20 years, might develop a deep and profound bond. But this was a love that was earned, a love that was the result of marriage, not its cause. To marry for a fleeting passion, for a feeling, would be to risk the entire enterprise. What if the passion fades? What if the pretty girl you married turns out to be a lazy worker who lets the fire go out? The consequences are not just emotional disappointment, they are hunger, poverty, and ruin. So love was a luxury, a happy accident. The primary concern was function, and this pragmatic, often grim view of marriage was reinforced by the single most powerful institution in their lives, the church, which had its own deeply ambivalent and often hostile view of love, sex, and human pleasure. The church taught that the world was a place of trial and temptation, and the pleasures of the flesh were one of the devil's most effective snares. While the nobility were busy turning unrequited love into a form of performance art, and the peasantry were focused on the brutally practical economics of marriage, the medieval church was waging a quiet, relentless war on the very idea of pleasure. Its teachings on love, marriage, and sexuality cast a long, somber shadow over every aspect of life, creating a pervasive culture of guilt, anxiety, and suspicion around the most natural human impulses. At the core of the Church's doctrine was a deep-seated ambivalence about the physical body itself, influenced by centuries of theological thought, particularly from figures like Saint Augustine. The body was seen as a vessel of sin, a constant source of temptation that dragged the noble soul down into the muck of worldly corruption. Sex, as the most powerful physical pleasure, was therefore deeply suspect. It was a necessary evil, a regrettable concession to the fallen nature of humanity. Its only legitimate purpose, the only reason it was tolerated at all within the sanctified bonds of marriage, was for procreation. That was it. Any other motivation, any hint of simple enjoyment, desire, or passion, was tainted with the sin of lust. Think about what this means for a married couple. Let's call them Eleanor and Robert, a respectable merchant couple living in a bustling town. They are married, they are faithful, they attend Mass, they are good Christians. Yet, in the privacy of their own bed, they are subject to a bewildering and intrusive set of rules laid down by the Church. According to the penitentials, the handbooks used by priests for confession, their physical relationship was a spiritual minefield. It was forbidden on Sundays, because that was the Lord's Day. It was forbidden on Wednesdays and Fridays, in memory of Christ's betrayal and crucifixion. It was forbidden for the 40 days of Lent and the 4 weeks of Advent. It was forbidden on all major feast days and saints' days. It was forbidden during the wife's pregnancy, and for 40 days after she gave birth. It was forbidden during her monthly menstruation. When you add it all up, a devout couple might find that sex was prohibited for more than half the year. It was a constant exercise in restraint, a perpetual reminder that their physical desires were at odds with their spiritual salvation, and even when it was permitted, it was freighted with guilt. Theologians debated the precise moral status of the pleasure experienced during the procreative act. The most rigorous view held that any pleasure felt, even within this licit context, was at best a venial sin, a small stain on the soul that required penance. The ideal was to perform the marital duty with a kind of grim determination, focused solely on the goal of conception, untainted by any sense of personal enjoyment. You can imagine the psychological burden this created. Every natural impulse became a source of potential damnation. Love and desire, which we see as the glue that binds a couple together, were framed as temptations to be overcome. The Church's view of women in this context was particularly grim. Building on the ancient story of Eve as the original temptress who led Adam into sin, women were often seen as inherently more lustful, more carnal than men. They were the gateway of the devil, their bodies a snare for unwary male souls. A man's spiritual journey was a constant battle against the temptations presented by the female form. This misogyny was woven into the very fabric of medieval thought. A woman was a necessary partner for procreation, the manager of his household, but she was also a constant spiritual threat. Marriage, from this perspective, was a form of damage control. It wasn't a celebration of love, but a container for dangerous sexual urges. It was, as St. Paul had written, better to marry than to burn with lust. This was not exactly a ringing endorsement. Marriage was the lesser of two evils, a spiritual compromise for those not holy enough to embrace the true ideal, lifelong celibacy. The priest, the monk, the nun, they were the spiritual elite. Their rejection of the flesh was a sign of their superior devotion. A married couple, by their very participation in the physical act of procreation, was on a lower spiritual plane. This created a strange paradox. Marriage was a sacrament, a holy institution, yet the act that defined it was steeped in sin and shame. This wasn't just abstract theology, it was preached from the pulpit and enforced in the confessional. It shaped the way people thought and felt about their own bodies and their most intimate relationships. It fostered a culture where love was separated from passion, and where the most profound human connection was viewed through a lens of suspicion, guilt, and fear. The joy of the body was a sin to be confessed, not a gift to be celebrated. The church's relentless focus on the sinfulness of pleasure had a profound and distorting effect on the medieval understanding of love. It created an environment where the expression of affection was fraught with anxiety. If even the marital embrace was spiritually perilous, where did that leave the gentler, everyday expressions of love? A lingering touch, a passionate kiss, a loving word, all could be seen as sparks that might ignite the dangerous fire of lust. Priests in the confessional would probe for these moments, asking penitents if they had taken pleasure in their spouse's company, if they had harbored lustful thoughts. The ideal was a kind of serene, dispassionate partnership, focused on shared piety and the practical business of running a household and raising children in the faith. This spiritual policing of intimacy meant that love, as an emotion, was often driven inward, hidden from view. To be overly affectionate with one's spouse in public was seen as unseemly, a sign of poor self-control. It suggested that your relationship was based on carnal rather than spiritual foundations. This is a stark contrast to our modern world, where public displays of affection are a common way of signaling a couple's bond. In the medieval context, such displays would signal a lack of piety. The very language of love was co-opted by religion. The most intense and passionate language was reserved for the love of God. The writings of mystics like Hadewich of Antwerp or Meister Eckhart describe their relationship with the divine in terms that are deeply, sometimes shockingly, erotic. They speak of a spiritual ecstasy, a union with God that is all-consuming and blissful. This was the only romance that was truly safe, truly noble. The love between a man and a woman was a pale, flawed imitation of this divine love, always in danger of slipping into idolatry, of placing the created being before the Creator. This hierarchy of love was clear. The love of God was supreme, and the love of one's spouse was a distant, secondary concern, to be handled with extreme caution. This created a strange vacuum in the emotional landscape. If passionate love between a husband and wife was sinful, but the cold, transactional nature of most marriages was unfulfilling, where could the powerful human need for romance go? It found its outlet in the bizarre and contradictory world of courtly love. That whole performance of chaste, agonizing devotion to an unattainable lady makes much more sense when you see it as a reaction against the church's restrictions. It was a way to experience the thrilling, overwhelming power of romantic love, but in a way that was, at least on the surface, spiritually safe. The love was for a married woman, so it couldn't be consummated. It was framed as a kind of spiritual devotion, with the lady taking on the role of a secular saint. The knight's suffering, his fasting and vigils, mimicked the ascetic practices of a monk. Courtly love was a clever, if deeply weird, end run around the church's war on pleasure. It created a parallel universe of romance, with its own rules, its own language, and its own morality, existing right alongside the official doctrines of the church. But this was a solution only for the elite. For the ordinary person, like our merchant Robert and his wife Eleanor, there was no such escape. There was only the daily struggle to navigate the complex rules of piety, to manage a household, and to find some measure of companionship and affection in a system designed to make them feel guilty about it. Imagine Eleanor, pregnant with her 5th child. She feels a surge of affection for her husband, who has brought her a small treat from the market. She wants to kiss him, to thank him. But a voice in the back of her head, the voice of the parish priest, whispers a warning. Is this affection pure, or is it a gateway to lust? Is she delighting in her husband, a mere mortal, more than she delights in God? This constant, low-level anxiety was the background noise of medieval marriage. It's no wonder that love, in this environment, was not seen as a source of joy and liberation, but as a problem to be managed, a danger to be contained. The church, in its attempt to elevate the soul, had declared war on the heart, leaving medieval people in a profound and difficult bind, caught between the demands of their faith and the undeniable pull of their own humanity. And it is in this context of repressed desire and spiritual anxiety that we begin to see another strange and disturbing fusion, the intertwining of love with violence. In a world where genuine affection was spiritually suspect and marriage was a pragmatic contract, the expression of strong emotion had to find other outlets. For the medieval aristocracy, a class of men bred for warfare, that outlet was often violence. Aggression, dominance, and conquest were the languages they understood best, and so, inevitably, these became the languages of love. The modern idea of romance as something gentle, tender, and nurturing would have been completely alien to a 13th century knight. For him, love was a quest, a battle, a prize to be won through strength and force of will. And this wasn't just a metaphor. The connection between love and violence was acted out in brutal and spectacular fashion. The most famous example, of course, is the tournament. We imagine them as colorful, sporting events, a kind of medieval Super Bowl with knights as star athletes. But early tournaments were not games. They were savage, chaotic melees, essentially unregulated training for war, fought over miles of countryside. Knights formed into teams and charged at each other with sharpened lances and swords. The goal was to capture and ransom opposing knights. Injuries were common, and deaths were far from rare. The church repeatedly tried to ban them, viewing them as dens of pointless violence and vanity. But the tournament was inextricably linked with the performance of love. A knight fought for the favor of his lady. He would wear her token, a sleeve, a glove, a scarf, on his helmet or shield. His valor in the brutal scrum was a direct reflection of the depth of his devotion. The more opponents he unhorsed, the more prisoners he took, the greater his love was proven to be. The lady, watching from the stands, was the audience for this display of ritualized violence. Her role was to inspire it, to be the cause for which men would risk their lives. A knight's love wasn't demonstrated by writing a sonnet, but by breaking a lance over another man's head in her name. This equation of love and bloodshed went far beyond the tournament grounds. In the romantic literature of the time, stories that were wildly popular among the nobility, the line between courtship and violent crime is often non-existent. Stalking, abduction, and forced marriage are frequently presented not as horrifying assaults, but as bold, romantic gestures. A hero proves the force of his passion by kidnapping the heroine from her father's castle or from her own wedding to another man. Lancelot's rescue of Guinevere from her execution is a whirlwind of violence in which he slaughters dozens of his fellow knights, some of whom were his friends. This is portrayed as the ultimate act of love and loyalty. The message was clear. True love is so powerful that it transcends ordinary morality. It justifies violence, even murder. This wasn't just confined to fiction. The chronicles of the time are filled with accounts of knights and nobles starting private wars over perceived slights to a lady's honor, or launching raids to abduct a wealthy heiress and force her into marriage. This was a direct and effective, if brutal, way of circumventing the endless negotiations of the marriage market. Why bargain for the bride when you can simply take her? The law was often ambiguous on this point. If a woman was abducted but later consented to the marriage, and under the circumstances, she had little choice but to consent, the crime was often forgiven. It was a high-risk, high-reward strategy for ambitious, landless knights. This bled into the very psychology of love and attraction. Men were conditioned to see aggression as a key component of courtship. To be gentle or hesitant was to be weak. A woman was something to be conquered, like an enemy fortress. And women, in turn, were conditioned to see this aggression as desirable, as proof of a man's worth and the intensity of his passion. A man who would fight and kill for you, that was a man who truly loved you. The quiet, gentle man who offered kindness and respect was simply not legible in this cultural framework. He was not performing masculinity in the correct way. Even the architecture of the time reflects this. The Lady in the Tower is a classic romantic image, but the tower was part of a castle, a military installation. She is an object to be protected, to be besieged, to be won. Her love is the prize at the center of the fortress. This fusion of romantic desire and military conquest created a deeply toxic ideal of love, one based on domination and submission, on violence and possession. It taught men that their feelings were best expressed through their fists and their swords, and it taught women to equate their own value with the amount of violence that could be committed in their name. Love wasn't about building a life together. It was about winning a war, and the prize in that war was not a partner, but a possession. The idea of women as property was not just a metaphor in the Middle Ages. It was a deeply embedded legal, social, and economic reality. This concept underpinned the entire system of marriage and inheritance, and it fundamentally shaped the experience of what was called love. A woman, from birth to death, was legally under the guardianship of a man. First her father, then her husband, and if her husband died, often her eldest son or another male relative. She had no independent legal identity. In the eyes of the law, she was a perpetual minor. This legal principle, known in English common law as coverture, meant that upon marriage, a woman's legal existence was suspended or covered by that of her husband. Everything she owned, any dowry she brought into the marriage, any land she inherited, became his property. He controlled it, he could sell it, he could do with it as he pleased. She could not sign a contract, sue someone in court, or write a will without his permission. She was, in a very real sense, his possession, not unlike his horse or his house. This framing of women as property had profound consequences for how love and relationships were understood. Let's consider the crime of adultery. In the medieval world, adultery was not seen as a mutual betrayal of trust between two partners. It was seen as a property crime committed by one man against another. A woman having an affair was a violation of her husband's property rights. The adulterous man was essentially a thief, stealing the use of the husband's property, and more importantly, threatening the purity of his bloodline. The legitimacy of his heirs was paramount, as it was through them that property and titles were passed down. A wife's infidelity put the entire system of inheritance at risk. For this reason, the punishment for a woman's adultery was often brutal and public. She could be shamed, beaten, confined to a convent for life, or even executed. Her male partner in the affair might be fined or face the husband's private vengeance, but the shame and the most severe legal penalties were reserved for the woman. She was the broken vessel, the contaminated property. A husband's infidelity, on the other hand, was viewed very differently. It was a sin, to be sure, a matter for the confessional, but it was not a crime in the same way. Unless he was dallying with the wife of another high-status man, it was generally considered a minor personal failing. It did not threaten his wife's property, since she had none, or the family bloodline, since any illegitimate children he fathered had no claim on his inheritance. This glaring double standard reveals the core logic of the system. It wasn't about fidelity as an emotional or moral bond. It was about protecting the property and lineage of the male head of household. This sense of ownership extended to the very concept of winning a woman. As we've seen, tournaments were often framed as contests for a lady's favor. Sometimes, this was literal. The winner of a tournament might be given the right to name the Queen of Love and Beauty, an honor that came with prestige. But in some cases, the prizes were more tangible. A powerful lord might offer the hand of his daughter or ward in marriage as the ultimate prize for a tournament victor. The woman becomes a literal trophy, her future handed over to the man who proved himself the most skilled warrior. This same mentality applied in times of war. When a castle or a town was captured, the women inside were often considered part of the spoils of war, along with the gold, the livestock, and the weapons. The abduction and rape of women during a siege was a common and accepted part of medieval warfare. It was a way of utterly humiliating the defeated men, a demonstration that they could not even protect their most valuable possessions. Again, we see this in the romantic literature of the time, which often blurs the line between a heroic rescue and a hostile takeover. The hero claims the heroine, and this language of claiming, of acquisition, is central. Love is not a partnership you enter into. It is a prize you win, a territory you conquer. The woman herself has very little agency in this narrative. She is the beautiful object that motivates the action, but she is rarely the one acting. Her role is to be desired, to be fought over, to be won, and ultimately, to be owned. This complete erasure of female autonomy is perhaps the most disgusting aspect of medieval romance to our modern sensibilities. The idea that love is a choice, that it is a free and mutual decision between two sovereign individuals, was simply not part of their worldview. Love was a system of power, and in that system, Women were not players. They were the currency. The reduction of women to the status of property had a chilling effect on the very possibility of romantic choice. Agency, the ability to make one's own decisions about one's life and heart, was a luxury that medieval women, regardless of their social class, simply did not have. Their paths were laid out for them by their male guardians, their value calculated in terms of land, alliances, and fecundity. This systemic lack of choice created a profound internal conflict, a disconnect between the inner world of personal feeling and the outer world of social duty. Imagine again our young noblewoman, Isabel, betrothed at 12 and married at 14 to a man she barely knows. She has been raised from birth to understand that her purpose is to be an obedient daughter and a dutiful wife. Her own desires, her own dreams, are irrelevant, even dangerous. She learns to suppress them, to present a placid, agreeable face to the world. But what if, despite all this conditioning, she feels something? What if she finds her husband, a coarse and brutish man twice her age, repulsive? What if her heart is drawn to someone else, a visiting musician, a young priest, or the knight who carries her husband's banner? These feelings cannot be acknowledged, let alone acted upon. They are a source of terror. To indulge them would be to risk everything: her reputation, her safety, even her life. Her only recourse is silence and prayer, a desperate attempt to crush the forbidden feelings that rise up within her. This is the quiet, hidden tragedy at the heart of the medieval romantic ideal. For every epic poem about a knight's glorious suffering for his lady, there were thousands of real women trapped in loveless, transactional marriages, their inner lives a secret garden of forbidden emotions. The culture of courtly love, in a strange way, offered a kind of fantasy outlet for this predicament. In the world of the poems and songs, the lady is all-powerful. She is the one in control, the one who sets the terms, the one whose favor is sought. The knight is her humble servant. This was a complete inversion of the real power dynamics of medieval society. It's no wonder these stories were so popular among aristocratic women. They provided a fictional space where they could imagine having the power and agency that was denied to them in their actual lives. In the fantasy, they could reject suitors, demand impossible quests, and be the center of the universe. In reality, they were pawns in a game played by men. But this fantasy had a dark side. It reinforced the idea that a woman's power was passive. She inspired action in men, but she did not act herself. Her role was to be beautiful, remote, and virtuous, an object of veneration. This ideal of the passive, perfect lady was just another kind of cage, albeit a gilded one. It placed an immense pressure on women to live up to an impossible standard of purity and piety, while denying them any real control over their own destinies. The consequences of stepping outside these prescribed roles were severe. A woman who was perceived as too forward, too intelligent, or too independent was immediately suspect. She was seen as unnatural, a threat to the social order. The historical record is filled with powerful women, queens, abbesses, noblewomen, who ruled in their own right, who were constantly battling accusations of witchcraft, sexual immorality, or political treachery. A woman with agency was a woman to be feared and, if possible, controlled. For a peasant woman, the situation was different, but not necessarily better. While she might have had a little more say in her choice of husband, her life was one of relentless labor. Her body was not her own. It belonged to her husband for labor and childbearing, and it belonged to her lord as a source of more laborers for his estate. The concept of romantic love as a private, personal journey of self-discovery would have been utterly meaningless to her. Her life was about communal survival, about the endless, back-breaking work of wresting a living from the earth. Love, if it came at all, was a small, fragile plant growing in the cracks of a stone wall. It was a moment of shared laughter while scything a field, the quiet warmth of a body next to hers on a cold night, the fierce, protective bond with the children she managed to raise past infancy. It was a love born of necessity and shared suffering, not of choice and romantic idealism. And so, across the entire social spectrum, the idea of a woman choosing her own path in love was revolutionary. almost unthinkable. It was a direct challenge to the foundations of their world, a world built on male ownership, patriarchal lineage, and the subjugation of female will. The romantic stories we tell ourselves about this period are a profound misreading of the past. We see a knight kneeling before a lady, and we think, romance. They would have seen a vassal pledging fealty to his lord, a carefully calibrated social performance. We have projected our own values onto their world, creating a beautiful but false image that obscures the harsh, uncomfortable truth. In the Middle Ages, love was not a choice a woman could make, but a fate that was decided for her. The constant tension between the cold, hard reality of arranged marriages and the soaring, impossible ideals of courtly love created a culture that was deeply fascinated by tragedy. If true happiness in love was either impossible or sinful, then the only way for love to achieve a kind of sublime purity was through suffering, and, ultimately, through death. A happy ending, a couple settling into a comfortable, long-term partnership, was seen as mundane, almost a failure. The greatest love stories of the Middle Ages are not comedies, they are tragedies. They are stories of passion so overwhelming that it can only lead to ruin. Death was not the end of the story, it was the romantic climax. Think of the foundational myths of medieval romance: Tristan and Isolde, Lancelot and Guinevere, Abelard and Heloise. These are not stories about people building a life together. They are stories about people being destroyed by a love that is too powerful for the world to contain. Tristan and Isolde, bound together by a mist-drunk love potion, are doomed from the start. Their love is a sickness, an irresistible force that compels them to betray their king and their honor. They spend their lives fleeing, hiding, and suffering, their brief moments of passion always overshadowed by the certainty of their tragic fate. Their love is inseparable from their pain. In the end, they die because of a simple, tragic misunderstanding, their deaths a final, perfect testament to a love that could never exist in the light of day. Their tomb becomes a shrine, a symbol of a love so pure that it could only be perfected in death. This wasn't just fiction, it was a cultural ideal. Death was seen as the ultimate romantic gesture, the final seal on a love that was too grand for this fallen world. Similarly, Lancelot and Guinevere's love for each other brings about the downfall of the greatest kingdom in the world, Camelot. Their passion leads to civil war, the death of countless knights, and the end of a golden age. Their story is a cautionary tale, but it is also a deeply romantic one. The greatness of their love is measured by the scale of the destruction it causes. They end their lives in penitence, in a monastery and a convent. Their love sublimated into a shared spiritual suffering that continues until their deaths. Again, happiness is never the goal. The goal is a kind of beautiful, soul-crushing tragedy. The story of Abelard and Heloise is perhaps the most poignant because it was real. Theirs was a love born of the mind, a passionate intellectual connection between the most famous philosopher in Europe and his brilliant young student. Their affair, and the secret marriage that followed, led to a brutal act of vengeance. Abelard was castrated by Heloise's enraged uncle. Their physical relationship was destroyed, but their love endured, transformed into a lifelong correspondence of breathtaking intellectual and emotional intensity. They lived out their days in separate religious orders, their love a thing of letters and memory. After their deaths, their bodies were eventually brought together, buried side by side, a final, romantic union that was denied to them in life. They became legends, their tomb a site of pilgrimage for lovers for centuries to come. What do all these stories tell us? They tell us that the medieval world had a deep-seated belief that true love and earthly happiness were incompatible. Love was an affliction, a form of divine madness. This idea was so pervasive that it was even codified in medical texts. Lovesickness, or amor herios, was a recognized medical condition with a specific set of symptoms: insomnia, weeping, loss of appetite, obsessive thoughts, a pale complexion, a racing pulse. It was considered a genuine and potentially fatal disease. Doctors would prescribe treatments ranging from listening to music and walking in beautiful meadows to, in more extreme cases, bloodletting or seeking out the company of other women to distract the afflicted man. The fact that this was treated as a real illness shows how seriously they took the idea of love as a destructive, all-consuming force. Even suicide for love, while condemned by the church as a mortal sin, was often romanticized in literature. The lover who kills himself because he cannot have his beloved is not a pathetic figure. He is a tragic hero, his final act a testament to the unbearable power of his passion. This cult of tragic love created a feedback loop. The stories shaped the culture, and the culture, in turn, produced more stories that glorified suffering and death. It taught people to measure the value of a relationship not by the joy it created, but by the pain it caused. A love that didn't hurt, a love that didn't threaten to destroy you, was not really love at all. It was a shallow, commonplace thing. The true, noble, unforgettable love was the one that led you to the brink of ruin, and perhaps over the edge. It was a love that found its ultimate consummation not in a shared life, but in a shared tomb. The romanticization of death and suffering was the logical endpoint of a worldview that was deeply suspicious of worldly happiness. If the physical world was a vale of tears, a place of trial and temptation, then any joy found within it was fleeting and suspect. True fulfillment, true union, could only be achieved in the hereafter. This belief system, promoted relentlessly by the church, seeped into the culture's understanding of love, turning it into a dress rehearsal for a tragic opera. The idea of happily ever after was, in this context, a profoundly un-Christian sentiment. It suggested a satisfaction with the mortal world, a turning away from the ultimate prize of heavenly salvation. The great love stories, therefore, had to end in separation and death to reinforce this lesson. The lovers' tragic fate on earth was a testament to the fact that their love was too pure, too perfect for this flawed world. It was a spiritual love, and its proper home was in heaven. This created a peculiar and morbid aesthetic around romance. Beauty was found in sorrow. A pale, weeping lady was more romantically compelling than a happy, laughing one. A knight pining away from lovesickness was more noble than one who was content. The symbols of love were not hearts and flowers, but tears, sleepless nights, and the cold stone of the sepulchre. This wasn't just an affectation of the poets. It had a real impact on how people perceived and processed their own emotions. If you fell in love, the cultural script available to you was one of tragedy. You were expected to suffer. Your suffering was a performance that proved the authenticity of your feelings to yourself and to others. It was a way of elevating your personal, messy emotions into something grand and significant, a part of the great, tragic story of love itself. Let's return to our young knight, Gilhem, pining for the unattainable Duchess. His friends see him growing pale and thin, and they nod in approval. He is playing his part in a well-understood drama. He is not just a frustrated young man, he is a tragic lover in the mold of Lancelot. His personal misery is transformed into a noble, artistic statement. This provided a kind of comfort, a way of making sense of the painful and often confusing experience of desire in a repressive society. It gave meaning to the suffering, but it also locked people into destructive emotional patterns. It taught them that love was supposed to hurt, that jealousy, obsession, and despair were not warning signs, but badges of honor. It discouraged compromise, communication, and the hard, unglamorous work of building a real, sustainable relationship. Why would you strive for a quiet life of mutual affection with a compatible partner when the culture was celebrating the glorious, soul-immolating flame of a doomed passion? The more practical, workaday love of a long-term marriage, whether in a peasant hut or a merchant's house, was simply not the stuff of romance. It was life. Romance was something else entirely. It was an escape from life, a brief, intense, and often fatal flight into a realm of heightened emotion. This is perhaps the greatest and most enduring misunderstanding about the period. We have inherited their stories but forgotten their context. We've taken the tragic figures of Tristan and Lancelot and turned them into romantic heroes in the modern sense, symbols of a love that conquers all. But for the medieval audience, they were something quite different. They were symbols of a love that destroys all. Their stories were thrilling, beautiful, and deeply seductive, but they were also meant as warnings. They were a testament to the awesome, terrifying power of a passion that, once unleashed, could not be controlled. The ultimate lesson was not to seek out such a love, but to fear it. And yet, the glamour of the tragedy was irresistible. It spoke to a deep human need for meaning, for our lives and our feelings to have weight and significance. In a world where individual lives were often short, brutal, and seemingly insignificant, the idea that you could be the hero of your own epic tragedy was a powerful one. It was a way of raging against the dying of the light, of leaving a beautiful, sorrowful story behind. The love of death was, in the end, a love of meaning. It was a belief that the only way to prove your life mattered was to have it end in a beautiful, heartbreaking catastrophe. And that, by any modern standard, is a truly devastating way to think about love. So we find ourselves in a world where the very concept of love is fractured into a series of strange and contradictory performances. On the one hand, you have the cold, pragmatic business of marriage, a transaction of property and bloodlines where personal affection is a liability. On the other, you have the ethereal, agonizing fantasy of courtly love, where desire is only noble if it is never fulfilled. You have the church condemning pleasure as a sin, framing marriage as a reluctant concession to human weakness. You have a warrior aristocracy that expresses its devotion through acts of spectacular violence. And overarching all of it, you have a cultural obsession with tragedy, a belief that the only truly great love is one that ends in death and ruin. What emerges from this picture is not the stuff of fairy tales. It's a vision of human connection that is deeply, fundamentally unhealthy by our standards. It is a world without emotional safety nets, a world where the heart is a dangerous and untrustworthy guide. Imagine trying to navigate your own feelings in such a landscape. Every impulse is suspect. Every relationship is governed by a set of rigid, external rules. If you are a woman, your feelings are irrelevant to your destiny. You are a piece on a board, moved by others. Your value lies in your womb and your dowry. If you are a man, you are taught that tenderness is weakness and aggression is strength. Your love is proven not by your kindness, but by your willingness to inflict or endure suffering. The entire system is built on a foundation of control, repression, and the denial of individual will. The romantic myths that we have built around this period, the chivalrous knight, the fair maiden, the love that conquers all, are a profound historical distortion. We have cherry-picked the most poetic elements, the beautiful language of the troubadours, and the dramatic gestures of the tournament, and stripped them of their dark and violent context. We have created a sanitized, Disney-fied version of the Middle Ages that bears little resemblance to the lived reality of the people of the time. The truth is that medieval romance was often a system of coercion with a poetic veneer. The knight pledging his life to his lady was participating in a power dynamic that reinforced the feudal hierarchy. The marriage contract that secured a dynasty's future did so at the cost of a young girl's childhood and autonomy. The epic poems that glorified tragic love were teaching people to find beauty in their own destruction. It's not that love, in the sense of genuine human affection, did not exist. It surely did, in quiet moments, in shared glances, in the bonds forged by years of shared hardship. A peasant couple, watching their children play in the dust outside their hut, may have felt a bond of love as deep and true as any we know today. A husband and wife, after decades of a pragmatic, arranged marriage, might have found a comfortable, quiet companionship. But these were not what the culture celebrated as romance. These were the private, unheralded successes of the human spirit, surviving in spite of the dominant culture, not because of it. The official, celebrated forms of love were the ones that were disgusting to us, the ones based on ownership, violence, emotional self-torture, and the worship of death. It is a stark reminder that the way we feel and think about love is not a timeless human universal. It is a product of our culture, our values, our economic systems, and our beliefs. Our modern ideal of romantic love, a partnership of equals based on free choice, mutual respect, emotional intimacy, and shared happiness, is a relatively recent invention. It would have been largely unrecognizable to the people of the Middle Ages. They would have looked at our relationships with bewilderment, and perhaps with scorn. They would have seen our focus on individual happiness as selfish, our belief in love as a choice as naive, and our desire for a happy ending as childish. And we, in turn, look back at their world and see a landscape of emotional brutality, a place where the heart was chained and love was a beautiful, terrible sickness. It's a vast and humbling distance, a testament to how profoundly the human experience can change over time. As we let this strange, dark world begin to fade, as the scent of wood smoke and damp stone gives way to the familiar quiet of your own room, perhaps we can hold on to that thought. The things we take for granted, the freedom to love who we choose, the belief that love should bring joy, not pain, are not givens. They are the fragile, hard-won products of a long and complicated history. And perhaps understanding the darkness of the past can help us to appreciate, just a little more, the light we have found. The disconnect between medieval and modern love is not merely a matter of custom. It's a fundamental difference in the perceived purpose of a relationship. For us, a romantic partnership is often seen as a primary source of personal fulfillment, a space for self-discovery and emotional support. For them, a relationship's purpose was almost entirely external. It was about fulfilling obligations to your family, to your Lord, to God. The idea of a relationship existing for the sake of the two individuals within it was a truly radical concept. Let's delve deeper into the mindset of a medieval father, a baron arranging his daughter's marriage. We see him as a callous monster, selling his child. He would have seen himself as a responsible, loving father, securing her future in the only way he knew how. In a world of constant, low-level warfare, political instability, and scarce resources, a powerful alliance was the greatest gift he could give her. It was a shield. Marrying her off to a strong neighbor meant she would be protected. She would be the lady of a great castle. Her children would be powerful and secure. To allow her to marry for love to a landless knight would be, in his eyes, an act of profound irresponsibility, an abandonment of his paternal duty. He would be casting her out into a dangerous world with no protection, all for the sake of a fleeting, youthful fancy. He is not motivated by a lack of love, but by a definition of love that is entirely alien to ours. His love is expressed through pragmatism, through strategic foresight, through the cold, hard currency of power. He is ensuring her survival in a brutal world. We seek a partner who will make us happy. He sought a partner for his daughter who would keep her alive. This fundamental difference in purpose explains so much of the behavior that seems so abhorrent to us. The child betrothals, for instance. To us, it is child abuse. To them, it was forward planning. The most advantageous alliances had to be secured early, before a rival family could snap up the prize. Betrothing his 7-year-old daughter to the 9-year-old son of a duke was like a modern parent opening a college savings account at birth. It was about securing the best possible future in a competitive and unforgiving market. The emotional cost to the child was simply not a variable in the equation. A child's feelings were considered malleable. Their duty was to adapt. And, for the most part, they did. A young girl sent to her new family would be raised to see her husband as her lord and master, her marriage as her destiny. She would not have been raised with our expectation of personal choice, so its absence would not have been felt as a profound loss in the same way. This is not to say it wasn't a traumatic and difficult experience, but it was a trauma that the culture normalized, that it presented as natural and necessary. The church played a crucial role in this normalization. By sanctifying marriage as a sacrament, it gave a holy seal of approval to these transactions. The priest's blessing over the terrified children at the church door laundered the deal, transforming a cold-blooded property merger into an act of God's will. It provided the moral and spiritual justification for a system that was, at its heart, about the consolidation of male power and property. It told everyone involved that this was the right and proper order of things, that to question it was to question God himself. This created a powerful and self-reinforcing system. The families arranged the marriages for strategic reasons. The individuals went along with it out of a sense of duty and a lack of alternatives, and the church blessed the entire arrangement as divinely ordained. Where in this closed loop is there any room for the disruptive, individualistic, and deeply personal force of romantic love? There is none. Love was something that happened outside the system, or in defiance of it. It was the stuff of illicit affairs, of whispered poems, of tragic stories. It was a bug in the code, not a feature. And that is why it was so often associated with danger, sin, and death. It was a force that threatened to undo the carefully constructed social and economic order. It was chaos. And in a world that craved order and stability above all else, chaos was the greatest enemy. Our modern world, in many ways, is built to accommodate the chaos of love. We have legal systems for divorce, social structures that support single individuals, and a culture that celebrates the pursuit of personal happiness. We have built a world where it is safe to fall in love. They had not. Their world was too fragile, too dangerous. Love was a fire that they could not afford to let burn out of control. So they tried to contain it, to channel it, to tame it. They contained it in marriage contracts, channeled it into religious devotion, and tamed it in the ritualized suffering of courtly love. But the fire was never truly extinguished. It smoldered beneath the surface, in the secret hearts of men and women who dared to feel something more than duty, and it burst forth in the tragic, beautiful, and terrible stories that they told themselves in the dark. Let's revisit the art of suffering, the strange phenomenon of courtly love, and examine it not just as a literary trope, but as a psychological coping mechanism. The aristocratic class of the High Middle Ages was a society of warriors living in a state of suspended animation. For much of the time, especially as feudal society became more stable, there wasn't a major war to fight. A knight was a highly trained, expensive, and aggressive specialist in violence, with a lot of time on his hands. This created a social problem. How do you keep a large class of armed and dangerous young men occupied and out of trouble? The tournament was one answer, and courtly love was another. It took the aggressive, competitive instincts of the knight and sublimated them into a non-violent, or at least less violent, arena. Instead of competing for territory, knights could compete for the intangible prize of a lady's favor. The quest for her love became a substitute for the quest for military glory. It gave the knight a purpose, a noble calling that filled the empty hours in the castle. It channeled his energy, his ambition, and his aggression into a highly ritualized and largely symbolic pursuit. The suffering was a key part of this sublimation. The knight's angst, his sleeplessness, his loss of appetite. These are the symptoms of a man in conflict, but the conflict has been turned inward. He is at war with his own desires. This internal battle was safer for society than an external one. A knight pining away in his chamber was not out starting a brawl in the courtyard or plotting to overthrow his lord. The elaborate rules and etiquette of courtly love were a form of social control, a game with high emotional stakes but, ideally, low real-world consequences. It was a way of civilizing the warrior class, of teaching them a new set of skills beyond the battlefield: poetry, music, elegant conversation, and the fine art of emotional restraint. But of course, it was a deeply dysfunctional system. By idealizing unfulfillment, it taught that satisfaction was vulgar. It created an ideal of love that was inherently narcissistic. The focus of courtly love is not really on the lady herself. She is often a blank canvas onto which the knight projects his own ideals. The true emotional drama is happening entirely within the knight. His love, his suffering, his nobility, it's all about him. The lady is the catalyst, the excuse for his own elaborate performance of feeling. He is the star of his own tragic romance. This had a profound effect on the understanding of male identity. It created a model of masculinity that was defined by intense, solitary, and often self-destructive emotion. This is a stark contrast to the classical ideal of the stoic, rational man. The medieval knight of romance is a creature of overwhelming passion, constantly on the verge of emotional collapse. He weeps, he faints, he falls into deep depressions. This emotional volatility was not seen as a weakness. It was the mark of a superior soul, a man capable of feeling more deeply than ordinary mortals. We can see a strange echo of this in modern romantic comedies, the idea of the grand gesture, the over-the-top public display of affection. It's a distant, sanitized descendant of the knight's tournament performance or his public display of lovesickness. It's the idea that the intensity of a feeling is proven by the extremity of the behavior it inspires. But in the medieval version, the behavior was not about winning the girl and living happily ever after. It was about the performance of suffering itself. The performance was the point. And what of the woman in this scenario, the object of all this stylized devotion? Her position was deeply ambiguous. On the one hand, she was elevated to the status of a goddess. She held the power to grant or withhold her favor, to inspire great deeds, to emotionally ruin the strongest of men. This gave her a form of power that was otherwise denied to her. But it was a fragile and illusory power. She was trapped in her role as the remote, untouchable ideal. She could not be a real person with her own needs, flaws, and desires. To do so would be to shatter the fantasy and bring the whole game crashing down. She was a living statue, beautiful and worshipped, but also silent and immobile. She was an icon, not a partner. The entire system of courtly love, for all its beautiful poetry and elegant manners, was built on a foundation of emotional dishonesty. It was a game of masks where no one was expected to say what they really meant or feel what they really felt. The knight pretended to be dying of chaste love, while perhaps secretly hoping for an illicit affair. The lady pretended to be an indifferent goddess, while perhaps feeling a mix of flattery, pity, fear, or even genuine affection. It was a complex and exhausting performance, a social theater of the heart, and like all systems built on a fundamental untruth, it was ultimately unsustainable. It created a world of profound emotional isolation, where everyone was trapped in their prescribed role, unable to form a genuine, honest connection. It was a beautiful prison, and the price of admission was your authentic self. Let's peel back another layer of the medieval marriage transaction and look at the dowry system in more detail. It's easy for us to dismiss it as simply selling a daughter, but the reality was more complex, and in some ways, more insidious. The dowry was not a payment for the bride. It was a payment made by the bride's family to the groom's family. It was, in essence, the daughter's share of her family's inheritance, given up front at the time of her marriage. This sounds reasonable on the surface, a way of providing for her in her new life. But in practice, it turned the woman into a walking financial portfolio, her value explicitly quantified and haggled over. The negotiations could be incredibly protracted and detailed. Let's imagine the fathers of our betrothed children, Isabel and her future husband, sitting down with their lawyers and stewards. The documents spread on the table would list every single asset. From Isabel's side, item, the manor of Oakhaven, with its 300 acres of arable land and 50 acres of meadow. Item, the rights to the toll bridge over the River Wren. Item, 100 head of sheep and 20 cows. Item, a chest of silver plate. Item, 3 silk gowns and a string of pearls. From the groom's side, they would be assessing this portfolio. Is Oakhaven's land fertile? Is the toll bridge profitable? Are the sheep healthy? The groom's family is essentially vetting an investment. If the dowry is deemed insufficient, they can walk away from the deal, leaving the bride-to-be and her family in a position of shame. This system placed immense pressure on families, especially those with multiple daughters. A father with 5 daughters faced the prospect of having to liquidate a significant portion of his estate to see them all married appropriately. A daughter without a substantial dowry was considered unmarriageable, at least within her own social class. Her only options might be a convent, which also required a form of dowry, an entrance fee, or a downward marriage to a man of lower status, a source of great shame for the family. This is the tragic figure of the poor relation, the spinster aunt who lives on the charity of her relatives because her family could not afford to marry her off. She is a living reminder of a failed financial transaction. Once the marriage took place, the dowry legally became the property of the husband. He had full control over it. He could manage the lands, spend the money, sell the assets. The wife had no say. The dowry was supposed to be for her support, and, in theory, it was to be returned to her or her family if the husband died first and they had no children. But in reality, it was often absorbed into the husband's estate and could be squandered through mismanagement, gambling, or political misfortune. A woman could bring immense wealth into a marriage and end her life in poverty, entirely at the mercy of her husband's decisions. This system had a devastating effect on a woman's sense of self-worth. From a young age, she would have understood that her value to her own family and her desirability to others was directly tied to the property she represented. She was not loved for who she was, but for what she was worth. This commodification of female identity was total and inescapable. It also created a perverse incentive system. A man might be tempted to marry a woman he found personally repulsive, or who was known to be cruel or foolish, simply because she came with an enormous dowry. The chronicles and literary tales are full of stories of mismatched couples, of old, ugly men married to beautiful young women, their union a transparently financial arrangement. Love, affection, and compatibility were simply not the primary considerations. The primary consideration was the balance sheet. For the woman, this meant that she could never be sure of her husband's affections. Did he love her, or did he love her lands? This uncertainty would have been a constant, corrosive presence in the relationship. Any affection he showed could be interpreted as a performance, an attempt to maintain good relations with the woman who was the source of his wealth. It prevented the growth of genuine trust and intimacy. The dowry system reveals the raw, economic heart of the medieval marriage. It strips away all the poetic trappings of romance and exposes the machine beneath. It is a system for the orderly transfer of property between male-led lineages, using women as the vehicle for that transfer. It is brutally pragmatic and deeply dehumanizing. It reduces a human being to a list of assets and makes her future contingent on a successful negotiation. To be a woman in this system was to know, from your earliest memories, that you had a price tag. And that is a truly disgusting foundation upon which to build a life, let alone a loving relationship. The Church's intricate system of rules surrounding marital sex was not just a matter of abstract theology. It had a very real and invasive enforcement mechanism: the sacrament of confession. The rise of private auricular confession in the early Middle Ages, where individuals confessed their sins one-on-one to a priest, created a powerful tool for social and psychological control. It allowed the Church to reach into the most private corners of a person's life, including the marriage bed. Imagine our merchant, Robert, kneeling in the darkness of the confessional booth. The priest, following the instructions in his penitential manual, begins to probe. "My son, have you known your wife carnally during the holy season of Lent? Have you approached her on a Sunday? Have you indulged in any unnatural positions, those not suited for the holy act of procreation? Have you taken pleasure in the act, for the sake of pleasure itself, rather than for the begetting of children?" These were not rhetorical questions. They demanded specific answers. Robert would be expected to recount his sins in detail. This process was, by its very nature, profoundly shaming. It took the most intimate aspect of his marriage and subjected it to the cold, judgmental scrutiny of a third party. It forced him to see his own natural desires through the lens of sin, to pathologize his own body and his relationship with his wife. After confessing, Robert would be assigned a penance. This could range from reciting a certain number of prayers to, for more serious or repeated offenses, long periods of fasting on bread and water, making a pilgrimage, or giving a significant sum of money to the church. This system of penance reinforced the idea that physical love was something that needed to be paid for, atoned for. It was a debt incurred against God, and it had to be settled. The psychological impact of this constant cycle of sin, confession, and penance must have been immense. It created a pervasive sense of guilt, a feeling that one was always falling short, always in a state of spiritual peril. It fostered a deep anxiety about sex, transforming it from a source of potential joy and connection into a source of fear and shame. It also gave the clergy enormous power over the laity. The priest was the gatekeeper to salvation. He held the keys to the kingdom, the power to absolve sins and remit punishment. This power was wielded not just in the confessional, but also from the pulpit. Sermons would be filled with lurid descriptions of the punishments that awaited the lustful in hell, with demons gleefully tormenting those who had indulged the pleasures of the flesh. This fear was a powerful motivator, encouraging compliance with the church's strict moral code. This system also had a particularly damaging effect on the relationship between husband and wife. It drove a wedge of suspicion and guilt between them. A wife might see her husband's advances not as an expression of affection, but as a temptation, a source of sin for them both. A husband might view his wife with a mixture of desire and resentment, seeing her as the cause of his spiritual struggles. It made open and honest communication about their intimate life virtually impossible. How could a couple discuss their desires and needs when the very language of desire was the language of sin? The church's ideal was a marriage of chaste companionship. The most revered married saints were those who, by mutual agreement, lived together as brother and sister, completely renouncing any physical relationship. Stories of these spiritual marriages were held up as the ultimate model of piety, a goal to which all married couples should aspire, even if it was unattainable for most. This constant upholding of an impossible ideal served to reinforce the sense of failure and sinfulness among ordinary people. They could never be as holy as Saint Cecilia and her husband Valerian, who lived in perfect chastity. Therefore, their own, normal, physical marriage was inherently flawed, inherently second best. The war on pleasure was not just a war on sex, it was a war on intimacy. It taught people to be suspicious of their own bodies, to fear their own desires, and to view their most profound human connections through a lens of guilt and spiritual anxiety. It was a system that, in its zeal to save the soul, did profound damage to the human heart. It created a world where love was constantly looking over its shoulder, terrified of its own shadow. And that fear, that pervasive guilt, is a poison that can curdle even the deepest affection. The glorification of violence as a romantic language was not merely a matter of individual knights showing off. It was a systemic feature of aristocratic culture, deeply embedded in their literature, their rituals, and their sense of self. The medieval romance genre, the blockbuster entertainment of its day, was saturated with this ethos. Let's take a closer look at a typical story. A knight falls in love with a lady he has only glimpsed. He doesn't try to get to know her, to talk to her, to win her over with his wit or kindness. Instead, he embarks on a series of violent quests. He fights giants, slays dragons, and defeats entire armies of rival knights. Each act of bloodshed is framed as an offering to his beloved, a testament to his love. The narrative explicitly links the greatness of his passion with the body count he racks up. The message is unambiguous. Love is proven through martial prowess. This created a dangerous feedback loop. The nobles, who were the primary audience for these stories, saw their own values reflected and glamorized. The stories, in turn, provided a script for how a true lover should behave, encouraging them to emulate the violent heroes of fiction in their own lives. A young man hearing these tales would learn that the path to a woman's heart was paved with the bodies of his enemies. This is the context in which the abduction fantasy becomes so potent. The story of a hero who kidnaps his beloved is a recurring motif. In the famous romance of Floret Blanchefleur, the hero Flore literally buys his beloved Blanchefleur out of a harem where she is being held captive. In other tales, the hero storms a castle to take the woman he desires. These acts are presented as daring and romantic, a demonstration of a love so powerful it cannot be constrained by mere laws or social conventions. The woman's consent is often an afterthought. It is assumed that she will be won over by the sheer force and audacity of her captor's passion. She is the passive prize, her own will secondary to the male protagonist's desire. This literary trope had a disturbing real-world parallel in the practice of bride abduction. For a knight with ambition but no land, abducting a wealthy heiress was a high-stakes career move. It was a way to bypass the lengthy and expensive process of formal marriage negotiations. If he could successfully capture the woman and force her to marry him, often through consummation, which was difficult to undo legally. He could gain control of her lands and fortune in a single, bold stroke. While officially illegal, it was a crime that was often tacitly accepted, especially if the abductor was powerful and the woman's family was weak. The line between a romantic elopement and a violent kidnapping was dangerously thin, and often depended entirely on who was telling the story. This culture also explains the prevalence of duels and private warfare fought over matters of honor, which were often linked to women. A perceived insult to a knight's lady was an insult to the knight himself, a challenge to his status and his martial reputation. He was obligated to respond with violence, not to defend the woman's actual feelings or reputation, but to defend his own honor as her champion. A woman could find herself the unwilling cause of a bloody feud, her name invoked in a conflict that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with the competitive, honor-obsessed world of male aristocrats. She was a symbol, a pretext for violence, rather than a person whose well-being was the primary concern. Let's imagine two knights, Sir Geoffroy and Sir Hughes, at a feast. Sir Hughes makes a slightly too familiar joke about Sir Geoffroy's beloved lady. For Sir Geoffroy, this is not a social gaffe. It is a mortal challenge. To ignore it would be to show weakness, to prove himself unworthy of his lady's favor. He challenges Sir Hughes to a duel. They meet at dawn with lance and sword. One or both of them may be maimed or killed. The lady in question may not have even heard the joke, and would likely be horrified by the bloodshed done in her name. But her feelings are irrelevant. The violence is not for her. It is for the sake of Sir Geoffroy's public identity as a man of honor and a worthy lover. This is the toxic logic of a system that equates love with domination. It teaches that passion is best expressed through aggression, that another person's affection is something to be won through conquest, and that violence is not the antithesis of romance, but its ultimate expression. It is a worldview that sees a battlefield as a more honest place for the heart than a quiet room, and it left no space for a love based on gentleness, equality, or mutual understanding. The legal and social status of women as property was not a subtle subtext. It was the blatant, organizing principle of society. The doctrine of coverture in English law, and similar principles across Europe, created a situation where a woman's identity was entirely relational. She was John's daughter, or William's wife, or Richard's widow. She was never simply herself. This had profound and far-reaching consequences that went well beyond marriage contracts. Consider the world of work. While peasant women worked alongside men in the fields and artisan women often worked in the family trade, their labor was legally considered to belong to their husbands. Any wages she earned were his. She could not run a business in her own name. If she was a skilled weaver or brewer, trades often dominated by women, the profits and the reputation of the business belonged to her husband. Upon his death, the business would pass to her son, not to her, even if she was the one with the actual skill and knowledge. This economic powerlessness reinforced her dependence and cemented her status as a subordinate. In the upper classes, this was even more pronounced. A noblewoman's primary job was to manage the household, a complex and demanding role that was essentially the work of a modern CEO. She would be responsible for supplies, staff, budgets, and the defense of the castle when her husband was away. Many women excelled at this, proving to be shrewd and capable administrators. Yet, their authority was always provisional, delegated to them by their husbands. They were managers, not owners. The moment he returned, or the moment her son came of age, her authority vanished. This legal non-existence also made women incredibly vulnerable. A woman had little legal recourse against a cruel or abusive husband. Since he was her legal guardian, bringing a complaint against him was like suing yourself. The law saw a husband's right to chastise his wife as a natural part of his authority, akin to his right to discipline his children or his servants. While there were limits, he was not supposed to kill or permanently maim her. The threshold for what was considered acceptable violence was horrifyingly high. A woman trapped in an abusive marriage had few options. Divorce was virtually impossible. Her family was unlikely to intervene, as it would mean breaking a strategic alliance and having to return the dowry. Her only hope was often her husband's death. The image of the merry widow in medieval literature is not just a stereotype. It reflects the reality that for many women, widowhood was the first time in their lives that they experienced any degree of autonomy and control over their own property and destiny. This property-based view of women also explains the particular horror with which female adultery was viewed. It was not just a moral failing, it was a form of treason against the patriarchal lineage. By introducing a cuckoo in the nest, an adulterous wife threatened to divert the family's entire inheritance, its lands, its titles, its very name, to the child of another man. It was the ultimate betrayal of the system. This is why Dante, in his Inferno, places flatterers in a lower circle of hell than murderers. But he places the carnal malefactors, like Paolo and Francesca, even lower, and the traitors at the very bottom, frozen in ice. Adultery was a sin that contained elements of both lust and treason, making it uniquely heinous in the medieval imagination. From our perspective, this entire system is built on a monstrous injustice. It denies half of humanity their basic personhood, but to them, it was the foundation of social order. The patriarchal family was the microcosm of the kingdom, with the husband as king. To challenge his authority was to challenge the entire hierarchy, from the lowest peasant up to the king and, ultimately, to God himself. It was a divinely ordained structure. In this context, the idea of love as a partnership between two free and equal individuals was not just romantic. It was a theological and political heresy. It was a radical, dangerous, and profoundly destabilizing idea. The system was designed precisely to prevent such a thing from ever taking root. The idea of the tournament as a romantic stage is one of the most enduring images of the Middle Ages. But we need to scrape away the varnish of centuries of romantic novels and Hollywood films to see it for what it was. The early tournament, the melee, was a brutal, chaotic war game. It was not fought in a neat, enclosed list field, but over a wide expanse of countryside, sometimes for days. The goal was simple: to capture opposing knights and hold them for ransom. It was a commercial enterprise, a way for a skilled but poor knight to make his fortune. The romantic element was grafted onto this violent business, a way of giving it a veneer of chivalric purpose. The lady's favor, the wearing of her sleeve or scarf, was a part of the pageantry, but the underlying reality was one of broken bones, financial ruin, and sometimes death. It was less like a tennis match and more like a barely regulated gang war. Over time, tournaments did become more ritualized and less deadly, evolving into the jousting contests we are more familiar with. But even here, the violence was real. A lance striking a helmet could snap a neck, and a fall from a galloping horse in full armor could be fatal. And the connection to love remained central. A knight's success in the joust was a public demonstration of his worthiness. It was a performance for a female audience. The winner was often crowned by the Queen of Love and Beauty, who was chosen for the day to preside over the festivities. In some cases, as we've seen, the prize could be far more substantial, including marriage to a specific lady. This practice of offering a woman as a literal prize in a sporting event is perhaps the starkest illustration of the property dynamic at play. Imagine being that woman. Your future, your life partner, is being decided by which of a dozen strangers is best at knocking the others off their horses. Your own preferences, your own character, your own hopes for a partner are completely irrelevant. You are the trophy. This objectification was not seen as insulting, it was seen as an honor. To be the prize in a great tournament was to be acknowledged as a woman of great beauty and high status. It was a public affirmation of your value as a commodity on the marriage market. Women in the audience were not passive spectators. They were active participants in this culture. They would give their tokens to their favored knights. Their cheers would encourage the violence, and their presence was essential to the meaning of the event. They were conditioned to see this ritualized combat as the highest form of romantic expression. The man who risked his life for her favor was the ideal lover. This created a dangerous link in the female psyche between love and violence, a belief that a man's love was proportional to his capacity for aggression. The gentle, scholarly, or peaceful man was, in this context, simply not a viable romantic prospect. He could not perform the necessary feats of arms to prove his worth. This is why in the romances, the clerkly or intellectual knight is often an object of ridicule, contrasted with the hyper, masculine, heroic warrior. The culture celebrated the sword, not the pen, as the ultimate tool of courtship. This entire spectacle of the tournament was a form of social theater, acting out the core values of the aristocracy. It celebrated martial skill, competitive honor, and the idea of women as the inspiration for and prize of male conflict. It was a spectacular, violent, and deeply romanticized expression of a profoundly unequal and oppressive gender dynamic. When we look at a painting of a knight kneeling to receive a scarf from a lady before a joust, we are not looking at a picture of mutual affection. We are looking at a carefully staged moment in a complex ritual of power, property, and violence. It is the beautiful, acceptable face of a system that was, at its heart, brutally transactional and deeply misogynistic. Let's delve deeper into the morbid romance with death, focusing on the real-life story of Peter Abelard and Heloise. Their tragedy became one of the most influential love stories in Western history, precisely because it was so perfectly, horribly tragic. It wasn't a story of knights and ladies, but of two of the most brilliant minds of the 12th century, and that made their fall all the more compelling. Abelard was the rock star of his day, the most famous philosopher and theologian in Paris. Students flocked from all over Europe to hear him lecture. He was brilliant, charismatic, and devastatingly arrogant. Heloise was a young woman of noble birth, living in Paris under the care of her uncle, Fulbert, a canon at the cathedral. She was a prodigy, renowned for her extraordinary intellect and her knowledge of Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. Fulbert, proud of his niece's talents, hired the most famous teacher in the city, Abelard, to be her private tutor. It was a catastrophic decision. Abelard, as he later wrote in his autobiography, a self-lacerating text called Historia Calamitatum, the story of my misfortunes, admitted that he seduced his brilliant student, but their connection was clearly more than that. It was a meeting of minds, a passionate, intellectual, and physical affair that they both knew was incredibly dangerous. Their love was a secret, carried on under the nose of her uncle in his own house. They were not just lovers, they were intellectual partners. Heloise was not a passive object of desire. She was Abelard's equal, challenging him, debating with him, engaging with him on the highest intellectual plane. This is what makes their stories so different from the typical courtly love narrative. It was a relationship of two minds, not just a knight's projected fantasy. But the inevitable happened. Heloise became pregnant. To try and salvage the situation, Abelard offered to marry her secretly. This was a huge sacrifice for him. As a famous cleric and academic, his career path led towards high office in the church, a path that required celibacy. Marriage would destroy his ambitions. Heloise, in a remarkable display of what she considered love, initially refused to marry him. She argued that marriage would ruin his career and that she would rather be his mistress than his wife, so that she would not be the cause of his downfall. She wrote that she preferred love to wedlock, freedom to a bond. This is a stunning rejection of the only respectable path available to a woman of her time. But Abelard insisted, and they were secretly married. Her uncle, however, was not appeased. He felt his family's honor had been destroyed. He wanted public vengeance, and he got it. He hired thugs who broke into Abelard's room one night and castrated him. This brutal act ended their physical relationship forever. It also ended Abelard's public career. Shamed and broken, he became a monk. He forced Heloise, against her will, to become a nun. Their love story, in a worldly sense, was over. But in another sense, it was just beginning. They began a correspondence that has survived to this day, a series of letters that are among the most powerful and heartbreaking documents of the Middle Ages. They debate theology, they discuss the governance of her convent, and they dissect the history of their love and its catastrophic consequences. Abelard is often full of self-pity and religious piety, trying to frame their love as a sin that God has justly punished. Heloise is more raw, more honest. She confesses that she still loves him, that she thinks of him constantly, that she regrets her vows as a nun because her heart is not in it. She writes, "They praise my chastity, but they do not know my hypocrisy." Their love, denied any physical or social expression, was transformed into a shared literary and spiritual martyrdom. They became living legends, the ultimate tragic couple. Their story was so powerful because it contained all the key elements of the medieval tragic romance. It was a forbidden love. It involved immense suffering. It ended in separation and a kind of living death, and it was ultimately sublimated into a spiritual and intellectual realm. After they died, decades apart, their bodies were eventually laid to rest in the same tomb. That tomb, now in the Père Lachaise cemetery in Paris, became a shrine for lovers. The story of Abelard and Heloise became the ultimate proof of the medieval romantic ideal, that the greatest love is not the one that leads to a happy life, but the one that leads to a beautiful, intellectual, and eternal tragedy. Their suffering made their love immortal. The diagnosis of lovesickness, or amor herios, in medieval medical texts is a fascinating window into the period's psychology. It shows that the connection between intense love and debilitating illness was not just a poetic metaphor. It was considered a literal, clinical reality. Physicians and scholars, drawing on a tradition that went back to ancient Greek and Roman medicine, treated lovesickness as a specific malady with a clear set of causes, symptoms, and potential cures. The cause was believed to be an imbalance of the humors, the four bodily fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, that were thought to govern a person's physical and mental state. Intense, obsessive love, especially for an unattainable object, was thought to overheat the blood and burn up the body's natural moisture, leading to an excess of black bile, the humor associated with melancholy and depression. The brain, it was thought, became fixated on the image of the beloved, unable to think of anything else. This constant, obsessive thought process generated immense heat and dried out the brain, leading to a range of severe symptoms. The descriptions in medical treatises like Avicenna's Canon of Medicine or Constantine the African's Viaticum are remarkably consistent. The lovesick patient, almost always presumed to be male, exhibits a hollow and tearful gaze. His pulse is irregular, fluttering at the mere mention of his beloved's name. He suffers from profound insomnia and, when he does sleep, is plagued by dreams of the one he desires. He loses all interest in food, company, and his usual activities. His body wastes away. His face becomes pale and drawn, and he falls into a state of deep, debilitating melancholy. If left untreated, the condition was believed to be potentially fatal. The patient could literally die of a broken heart, his body consumed by the fire of his own passion. The proposed treatments were a strange mix of the physiological and the psychological. On the physical side, doctors recommended a cooling and moistening diet to counteract the heat of the passion. Patients were advised to eat soothing foods, take long baths, and get plenty of fresh air. Bloodletting was sometimes used to release the excess heat from the body. On the psychological side, the cures were all about distraction. The patient was advised to listen to pleasant music, to engage in gentle conversation with friends, to take walks in beautiful gardens, or to focus his mind on a complex intellectual problem. The goal was to break the brain's obsessive focus on the image of the beloved. Some cures were more extreme. One common prescription was to find faults in the beloved. The patient's friends were instructed to speak ill of the lady, to point out her physical flaws or her bad character, in an attempt to shatter the idealized image in the lover's mind. Another, more cynical cure was to arrange for the lover to have a physical relationship with another, lesser woman. The idea was that this would vent the physical pressure of his desire and cure his obsession with the unattainable ideal. The most effective cure, of course, was to obtain the object of desire. If the lover could be united with his beloved, the sickness would vanish. But since the classic case of lovesickness involved an unattainable lady, this was rarely an option. The very existence of this diagnosis reveals so much about the medieval worldview. It shows a culture that took the power of love incredibly seriously, viewing it as a force capable of overwhelming the body and mind. It medicalized the suffering that the poets were busy romanticizing. The knight in the poem and the patient in the medical text were two sides of the same coin, but it also reveals a deep fear of that power. Lovesickness was a disease that needed to be cured. Passion was a pathology. The goal of the physician was to restore the patient to a state of rational, balanced, and dispassionate health. This stands in stark contrast to our modern tendency to romanticize the madness of love. We might see the lovesick patient as a tragic hero. The medieval doctor saw him as a man whose humors were out of whack and who needed to get a grip. The diagnosis of lovesickness perfectly encapsulates the contradictions of the medieval attitude towards love. It was at once the noblest calling and a dangerous disease. It was a state of spiritual elevation and a sign of physiological imbalance. It was something to be aspired to in poetry and something to be cured in the physician's office. To be in love was to be simultaneously blessed and cursed, a hero and a patient, walking a razor's edge between transcendence and self-destruction. Let's stand back and look at the whole tapestry we've been weaving. What do we see? We see a world where the fundamental assumptions about love, partnership, and identity are the mirror image of our own. We have constructed our modern idea of romance around the pillars of individual choice, emotional intimacy, and shared happiness. Theirs was built on the foundations of social duty, strategic alliance, and the suppression of individual will. The things we see as the very purpose of a relationship, personal fulfillment, companionship, mutual support, they would have seen as secondary benefits at best and dangerous distractions at worst. Our ideal is a partnership of two wholes, freely choosing to unite. Their ideal was the seamless merger of two family interests, using two individuals as the legal instruments of that merger. It is this fundamental, structural difference that makes their world seem so disgusting to us. The child marriages, the dowry negotiations, the legal non-existence of women. These are not isolated bugs in the system. They are the core features of a system designed for a purpose entirely different from our own. It was a system designed to ensure stability, to preserve property, and to maintain a rigid social hierarchy in a dangerous and uncertain world. Love, in its chaotic, unpredictable, and fiercely individualistic form, was a direct threat to that system. Therefore, it had to be controlled, channeled, and defanged. The church tried to control it by loading it with guilt and rules, redirecting its energy toward God. The aristocracy tried to channel it into the stylized, non-threatening performance of courtly love. The culture at large tried to defang it by framing its most destructive outcomes as beautiful and tragic, turning its victims into romantic martyrs. But the very existence of these elaborate control mechanisms is proof of love's enduring power. You don't build such massive dams unless you are trying to hold back a powerful river. Beneath the surface of this rigid, repressive society, the river of human affection continued to flow. It flowed in the secret glances between a knight and a lady, in the shared hardships of a peasant couple, in the passionate, forbidden letters of a scholar and his student. The tragedy of the Middle Ages is not that love didn't exist, but that the society was so profoundly ill-equipped to handle it. It had no healthy outlets, no safe spaces. To love freely was to declare war on the established order. This is why their great love stories are all tales of outlaws. Tristan and Isolde, Lancelot and Guinevere, Abelard and Heloise. They are fugitives from a society that has no place for their passion. Their love forces them outside the bounds of law, honor, and religion. Their tragedy is not just personal. It is a collision between the irresistible force of individual desire and the immovable object of social structure. When we recoil from the disgusting aspects of medieval love, we are really recoiling from the absence of our own most cherished values: freedom, equality, and the right to personal happiness. We are lucky enough to live in a world that, for all its flaws, has largely come to accept these values as the foundation of a good life and a good relationship. We have the luxury of marrying for love. We have the freedom to choose our own partners, to build our own lives, to seek our own happiness. We stand on the other side of a profound historical revolution, a revolution in human consciousness that has redefined the very meaning of love. Understanding the medieval world in all its harsh, uncomfortable reality is not about judging it. It is about understanding the distance we have traveled. It is about recognizing that our way of loving is not a timeless absolute, but a cultural construction, one that was built over centuries, often in reaction to the very systems that we now find so repellent. As you drift off to sleep, let the strange, alien landscape of the medieval heart fade away. Let go of the cold castles, the rigid rules, the beautiful, painful stories. And perhaps, in the quiet of your own world, you can feel a small sense of gratitude for the simple, radical, and profoundly modern idea that love can be a source of joy, a partnership of equals, and a safe harbor for the human heart. It is a fragile inheritance, and one worth cherishing. As the night deepens, let's consider the peasant's world one more time, not through the lens of pure economics, but with an eye for the small, unrecorded moments of affection that must have existed. While the nobles were playing their elaborate games of love, and the church was tallying sins, millions of ordinary people were simply trying to live. Their lives were not recorded in epic poems or theological treatises. Their love stories are lost to us, buried under centuries of silence. But they must have been there. Imagine a young couple, let's call them Agnes and Perrin. Their marriage was, of course, a practical arrangement. Her family had a strong ox. His had a good plot of land near the river. Together, they made a viable farming unit. Their first years are hard. The work is relentless, from sunrise to sunset. They share a single, smoky room with his parents and a younger sibling. There is no privacy, no space for the delicate cultivation of romance. Their conversations are about the weather, the state of the crops, the Lord's latest demands for taxes. And yet, there are moments. A moment when Perrin returns from the forest with a handful of wild berries, just for her. A moment when Agnes, seeing him exhausted and shivering after a day of plowing in the rain, gives him her own meager portion of the stew first. A moment, after a good harvest, when they sit together by the fire, not speaking, but feeling a shared sense of relief and accomplishment that needs no words. A moment when their first child is born, and they look at this tiny, new life they have created together. A fragile link in a chain stretching back into the past and forward into an uncertain future. This is not the grand, dramatic passion of Tristan and Isolde. It is a love built slowly, quietly, out of 1,000 small acts of mutual care and reliance. It is a love that is woven into the very fabric of their shared struggle for survival. It is not romantic, but it is real. It is grounded in the earth they work, in the bread they bake, in the children they raise. This kind of love had no name in the grand literature of the time. It was too common, too mundane. But it may have been the most widespread, and in its own way, the most successful form of love in the Middle Ages. It was a partnership in the truest sense of the word, a bond forged not in the fire of passion, but in the crucible of shared labor. This is not to romanticize the peasant's life. It was a life of incredible hardship, poverty, and vulnerability. But it is to suggest that even in the harshest of circumstances, the human capacity for affection, for loyalty, for a quiet, resilient love, can find a way to grow. This love was not disgusting. It was, perhaps, the most wholesome thing in a world full of unhealthy ideas about romance. But it was invisible. The culture did not value it. The stories that were told, the songs that were sung, were not about Agnes and Perrin. They were about knights and ladies, about suffering and death. This is the great tragedy of our historical record. The loudest voices, the ones who had the power and the leisure to write things down, were those of the elite. And their vision of love was the one that has been passed down to us, a vision that was often neurotic, violent, and obsessed with its own beautiful misery. The quiet, functional, and perhaps genuinely loving partnerships of ordinary people went unrecorded. We have to read between the lines of legal documents and parish records to catch faint glimpses of them. We see a will where a man leaves his meager possessions. To my beloved wife, Agnes. We see a court record where a husband defends his wife against an accusation. These are tiny sparks in the darkness, hints of a world of feeling that has been almost entirely lost. So as we reflect on the strangeness of the medieval heart, it's important to remember this silence. We have been exploring the official ideologies of love, the grand, flawed systems that dominated the culture. But beneath that official story, there was always another story, the unwritten story of millions of people who simply tried to care for one another in a difficult world. Their love was not a performance or a transaction. It was a survival strategy. And in its own quiet, unglamorous way, it may have been the truest love of all. Let's return to the idea of violence as romance and look at it from the woman's perspective. How did a noble woman experience a world where her favor was the pretext for brutal combat? It's a complex psychological position. On the surface, it was flattering. To be the queen of the tournament, to have knights risking their lives for a glance from you, was a public affirmation of your desirability and status. It placed you at the very center of the most important social ritual of your class. You were the still point around which the violent world of men revolved. This could be a heady, intoxicating experience. Imagine being a young lady, let's call her Alienor. She sits in the stands, dressed in her finest silk. Below, two knights charge at each other, their lances aimed to kill or maim. One of them wears her sleeve tied to his helmet. When he shatters his lance on his opponent's shield and sends him tumbling to the ground, the crowd roars, and Alienor feels a surge of, what? Pride, excitement, power. The violence is a direct measure of her own worth. The more spectacular the crash, the greater her value. She is conditioned from birth to see this as the pinnacle of romance. The stories she has heard, the songs she has sung, all reinforce this connection. The brave warrior is the ultimate romantic hero. The violence is not ugly. It is a beautiful and necessary part of the courtship ritual. But beneath this surface of conditioned acceptance, there must have been other feelings. Fear, perhaps. The knight fighting for her could be her brother, her cousin, or a man she genuinely cares for. The sport could end in his death. There must have been a constant, low-level anxiety associated with these events. There might also have been a sense of profound absurdity. The two men trying to kill each other below might be fighting over a perceived slight that never happened, or over a love that was nothing more than a formal, public declaration. Alienor might feel nothing for the knight wearing her favor. She might even dislike him. But she is trapped in her role. She must smile. She must wave. She must play the part of the gracious and inspiring muse. She has no power to stop the violence being done in her name. Her role is to be its beautiful, silent justification. This dynamic, being simultaneously elevated and powerless, is one of the defining features of the noblewoman's experience. She is placed on a pedestal, but the pedestal is a cage. She is worshipped as a goddess, but a goddess has no freedom. She is the cause of the action, but she has no agency within it. This is particularly true in the case of abduction. The romantic literature presents the abducted heroine as swept away by an irresistible passion. The reality would have been terrifying. Imagine being seized by armed men, dragged from your home, and forced into a marriage with a man you may not know or may actively despise. The act itself is a brutal assertion of ownership. It says, "You belong to me now." The woman's consent is rendered irrelevant by the act of force. And yet, the culture provided a script for her to reinterpret this trauma as romance. She could tell herself, and others, that she was won by a bold and decisive man. She could frame his violence as a sign of his overwhelming love. This was a psychological survival mechanism, a way of making an unbearable situation bearable. It was a way of reclaiming some semblance of agency by choosing to love her captor after the fact. We see this pattern repeated over and over again in the literature. The initially resistant heroine is eventually won over by her abductor's persistence and passion. This narrative served a crucial social function. It normalized and romanticized an act of violence against women, turning a crime into a courtship strategy. It taught women that their no did not really mean no, that it was just a part of the game of romantic pursuit. It taught them to see their own fear and resistance as a temporary state that would eventually give way to love. It is a profoundly dangerous and damaging narrative, and its echoes can still be found in some corners of our own culture. The idea of the bad boy who can be tamed by a good woman's love, the belief that jealousy and possessiveness are signs of true passion. These are the faint, toxic descendants of the medieval knight who proved his love with his sword. Let's consider the physical environment of medieval love. We imagine castles as grand, romantic settings, but the reality was far from comfortable. A castle was a military fortress first, and a home second. The Great Hall, where the lord and lady would preside, was a vast, drafty, public space. It was the center of all activity. Meals were eaten there, business was conducted there, justice was dispensed there. At night, servants and men-at-arms would often sleep on the floor. Privacy was a concept that barely existed. The lord and lady might have a private chamber, the solar, but even this was not a sanctuary in the modern sense. It was also an office, a reception room, and a bedroom for personal attendants who would sleep at the foot of the bed. The bed itself was a large, curtained structure, a room within a room, but the idea of being truly alone together was a rare luxury. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, greasy food, wood smoke from the central hearth that never quite found its way out through the hole in the roof, and the nearby presence of livestock and human waste. It was a world of loud noises, constant interruptions, and a complete lack of personal space. How does romance blossom in such an environment? The answer is that it had to be a public performance. A love affair, whether the licit affair of a married couple or the illicit affair of courtly lovers, was lived out in the full view of the community. Every glance, every word, every gesture was subject to scrutiny and interpretation. This is why the rules of etiquette were so important. They provided a shared language for navigating these complex public-private spaces. A knight could signal his devotion to a lady through a series of highly stylized, almost coded gestures that would be understood by the initiated but might seem innocuous to a casual observer. He might sigh dramatically whenever she entered the room. He might refuse to eat, claiming his love had stolen his appetite. He might challenge another knight to a game of chess and declare that he was playing for his lady's honor. These were all ways of conducting a romance in public without necessarily breaking any explicit rules. For a married couple, the lack of privacy meant that their relationship was also a public matter. Their ability to produce heirs, their personal compatibility or lack thereof, their arguments and affections, all were, to some extent, common knowledge within the household. A lord and lady were expected to present a united front, to embody the stability and order of their domain. Their personal feelings were secondary to this public role. This constant public scrutiny must have been exhausting. It meant that relationships were never just about the two people involved. They were always about the wider community, about honor, reputation, and the maintenance of the social order. This is a stark contrast to our modern ideal of love as a private refuge from the world. For them, love and relationships were a central part of the public world, subject to its pressures and its demands. The sensory experience of this world was also profoundly different. We are accustomed to a world of light, cleanliness, and quiet. Theirs was a world of darkness, filth, and noise. The nights were truly dark, lit only by a flickering candle or the faint glow of the embers in the hearth. This darkness could provide a cloak for secret meetings, but it was also filled with fear of the unknown, of the things that lurked beyond the small circle of light. The lack of sanitation meant that disease was a constant threat. A simple infection could be a death sentence. Life was precarious, and this sense of fragility shaped their worldview. The carpe diem, seize the day, mentality was not about carefree pleasure, seeking. It was a grim recognition that you might not be here tomorrow. This might have lent an urgency to their passions, a sense of needing to feel intensely in the short time they had. But it was an intensity born of anxiety, not joy. The sounds of the castle would have been a constant cacophony, the ringing of the blacksmith's hammer, the barking of dogs, the chatter of servants, the crying of children, the sound of men practicing with their swords in the bailey. There was no escape from the noise, no quiet corner to retreat to. In such a world, perhaps the most romantic thing imaginable was a moment of silence, a shared instant of peace in the midst of the chaos. Perhaps the most profound connection was not one that was declared with loud, violent gestures, but one that was found in a rare, stolen moment of quiet companionship. The Church's war on pleasure wasn't just about sex. It extended to many other aspects of life: creating a culture that was deeply suspicious of worldly enjoyment in general. Feasting, for example, was a central part of aristocratic life, a way to display wealth and hospitality, but it was also seen as a temptation to the sin of gluttony. Preachers would rail against the excesses of the rich, their tables laden with exotic spices and roasted meats, while the poor starved. A good Christian was expected to be temperate in their eating and drinking, to view food as fuel for the body, not as a source of sensual pleasure. The liturgical calendar itself was a tool for enforcing this discipline. The long fasts of Lent and Advent, along with the weekly fasts on Fridays, meant that for a significant portion of the year, the diet was restricted to simple, plain foods like bread, vegetables, and fish. These fasts were not just a religious observance, they were a form of spiritual training, designed to teach the body to submit to the will of the soul, to deny its cravings for pleasure. Music and dancing were also suspect. While sacred music was an essential part of the liturgy, secular music, especially the love songs of the troubadours, was often condemned as frivolous and immoral. Dancing was seen as particularly dangerous, as the physical contact and rhythmic movements could easily incite lustful thoughts. The image of the danse macabre, the skeletal figure of death leading people from all walks of life in a final grim dance, was a popular artistic motif, a reminder that the fleeting pleasures of the dance would end in the grave. Even clothing was a moral minefield. The church preached against vanity and extravagance. The fashion for brightly colored fabrics, elaborate sleeves, and pointed shoes among the nobility was seen as a sign of pride and a wasteful indulgence. Moralists wrote scathing critiques of fashionable men and women, accusing them of being more concerned with decorating their sinful bodies than with caring for their immortal souls. A pious person was expected to dress simply and modestly, in sober colors and durable fabrics. This pervasive culture of anti-hedonism created a general atmosphere of guilt around any form of worldly pleasure. To enjoy life too much was to risk forgetting about the life to come. It was to become too attached to this vale of tears, to mistake the inn for the destination. This mindset fundamentally shaped the possibilities for love and romance. A relationship based on shared fun, laughter, and the enjoyment of life's pleasures would have been seen as spiritually shallow. The ideal relationship was one based on shared piety, on mutual encouragement in the struggle against sin, on a joint preparation for the afterlife. This is why the stories of spiritual marriages, where a husband and wife lived together in perfect chastity, were so admired. They represented the ultimate victory of the soul over the body, the complete triumph of spiritual love over carnal desire. It also helps to explain the romanticization of sorrow. If joy is suspect, then sorrow becomes a mark of spiritual seriousness. A person who is sad is a person who is contemplating the sorry state of the world and their own sinfulness. They are not being distracted by frivolous pleasures. A tragic love story, full of weeping and despair, was therefore more spiritually respectable than a happy one. The suffering of the lovers was a kind of penance, a purification of their passion. It elevated their love from a mere worldly attachment to a grand, spiritual drama. This doesn't mean that medieval people didn't have fun. They feasted, they danced, they sang, they fell in love. But they did so under a constant cloud of official disapproval. They lived with a voice in the back of their heads, the voice of the preacher, telling them that every moment of pleasure was a step closer to damnation. This created a profound tension, a sense of living in two worlds at once: the vibrant, colorful, sensual world of everyday life, and the somber, guilt-ridden world of official morality. Love was caught in the middle of this conflict, pulled between the natural human desire for joy and connection and the religious imperative to reject the world and its pleasures. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit that love survived at all in such a hostile climate. Let's imagine the journey of a young bride sent from her home to marry a man she has never met. This was a common experience for women of the nobility, and it encapsulates so many of the harsh realities of their world. Our bride, let's call her Emmeline, is 13 years old. She has just said goodbye to her mother, her father, her siblings, everyone she has ever known. She is setting out on a journey of several weeks, perhaps even months, to a foreign land. She may not even speak the language of her new home. She travels with a small retinue of servants and a guard of armed men, a clear sign that this is a valuable and vulnerable piece of cargo being transported. The journey itself is arduous and dangerous. The roads are unpaved, often little more than muddy tracks. They will travel on horseback or in a jolting, uncomfortable litter. They will sleep in crowded, dirty inns, or in the castles of other nobles who may or may not be friendly. There is the constant threat of bad weather, sickness, and bandits. For Emmeline, this physical hardship is compounded by a profound sense of fear and isolation. She is leaving the only world she has ever known and heading into a complete unknown. The man she is to marry is just a name, a description in a letter, perhaps a stiffly painted portrait that tells her nothing of his character. Will he be kind or cruel, old or young? Will her new mother-in-law treat her as a daughter or as a rival? Her entire future happiness rests on the answers to these questions, and she has no control over any of them. Upon her arrival, she is a stranger in a strange land. She must learn new customs, new faces, a new language. She is being constantly judged. Her new family will be assessing her, wondering if they made a good bargain. Do her manners reflect well on her upbringing? Is she suitably pious and obedient? And, most importantly, does she seem healthy and fertile, capable of producing the all-important male heir? Her first meeting with her husband is a moment of intense anxiety. This is the man who will have complete legal and physical control over her for the rest of her life. The wedding ceremony that follows is not a celebration of her personal choice, but a public formalization of the contract her family has made. She is the living seal on the deal. The wedding night, the ritual of public bedding, is the final, terrifying step in this process of transfer. She is led to the marriage bed, often by a crowd of drunk and joking relatives, and left alone with a man who is essentially a stranger. This is not the culmination of a romance. It is the consummation of a business deal. The emotional trauma of this experience is difficult for us to fully comprehend. We are raised on the idea that marriage should be the free and joyful choice of two individuals. For Emmeline, it is a duty, a sacrifice, an ordeal to be endured for the sake of her family. Her personal feelings are not part of the equation. She is expected to adapt, to obey, and to find her place in her new life. And many women did. They were survivors. They learned to navigate the complex politics of their new households, to manage their estates, to raise their children, and perhaps, over time, to find a measure of affection or at least a working partnership with their husbands. But we cannot forget the initial act of violence that underpins this entire process. The uprooting of a child from her home and her transplantation into a foreign environment for political and economic gain. It is a form of human trafficking, sanitized by custom and sanctified by religion. The journey of the medieval bride is a stark reminder that for women, the world was often a place of profound powerlessness, where their lives and bodies were assets to be traded by men. And any love that grew in such soil was a testament to the resilience of the human heart, not to the kindness of the world it inhabited. The concept of stalking, which we see as a creepy and criminal violation of personal boundaries, was often framed as a romantic and noble endeavor in the medieval world, especially within the context of courtly love. The lovesick knight's obsessive focus on his lady was not seen as harassment. It was seen as proof of his singular devotion. His constant presence, his lingering gazes, his attempts to be near her, these were the signs of a true and faithful lover. Let's trace the actions of our knight, Guilhem, from this perspective. He learns the lady's daily routine. He knows when she will attend Mass in the castle chapel, and he makes sure to be there, hiding behind a pillar, just to catch a glimpse of her. He knows which balcony she favors for taking the air in the afternoon, and he will stand for hours in the courtyard below, hoping she will appear. He follows her when she goes out riding with her attendants, keeping a respectful distance, but always watching. To us, this is the behavior of a stalker. It is intrusive, obsessive, and unsettling. To the medieval mind, conditioned by the literature of courtly love, this is the behavior of a hero. He is demonstrating his constancy. His love is so great that he cannot bear to be out of her presence. even if he can never speak to her. The lady herself is placed in an ambiguous position. If she were to complain about this constant surveillance, she might be seen as cruel and ungrateful. She is supposed to be flattered by this obsessive attention. It is a tribute to her beauty and virtue. To reject it would be to reject the entire game of courtly love, to show herself as someone who does not understand the rules of refined behavior. So she is forced to tolerate it, to pretend not to notice, or to interpret it as the highest form of compliment. This romanticization of obsessive behavior is deeply rooted in the literature. In many romances, the hero's love begins with him secretly observing the heroine. He falls in love with her from afar, often without her knowledge. His love is born and nurtured in secrecy and surveillance. This sets up a dynamic where the male gaze is powerful and romantic, and the female object of that gaze is passive and unaware. The power imbalance is there from the very beginning. The story of Aucassin and Nicolette involves the hero, Aucassin, being imprisoned in a tower by his father to keep him away from his beloved Nicolette. He spends his days staring out the window, hoping to see her. This is presented as a touching display of lovesickness, not as a creepy obsession. When Nicolette escapes her own imprisonment, she comes and sings beneath his window, a mutual and consensual act. But the initial phase of unrequited, obsessive gazing is a common trope. This normalization of stalking behavior is another example of how medieval culture channeled male aggression and desire into forms that were considered socially acceptable, if not ideal. Instead of physically attacking his rivals, the knight channels his obsessive energy into this constant, passive-aggressive surveillance. It is a civilized form of possessiveness. He is not claiming her body, but he is claiming her with his eyes, making her the unwilling subject of his constant attention. This had dangerous implications. It taught men that intense, unreciprocated focus on a woman was a valid form of courtship. It taught them that a woman's boundaries were not something to be respected, but something to be patiently and persistently worn down. It blurred the line between devotion and obsession, between romance and harassment, and it taught women that being the object of this kind of intense, unwanted attention was something they should find flattering. It is a toxic and unhealthy model for a relationship, built on a foundation of power imbalance and a complete disregard for the woman's personal space and autonomy. It is another example of how a behavior that we now recognize as harmful was once dressed up in the beautiful, deceptive language of love. Let's revisit the medieval peasant marriage, but this time with a focus on the role of the community. In the modern world, we see marriage as a private affair between two individuals. In the medieval village, marriage was a public, communal concern. The success or failure of a marriage had an impact on the entire village. Agnes and Perrin's partnership was not just their own business. It was a building block of the community's economic and social stability. The community was involved from the very beginning. The choice of a partner was often influenced by village gossip and reputation. Everyone knew who was a hard worker, who was lazy, who was quarrelsome, who was kind. A young man or woman's market value was a matter of public knowledge. The negotiations between the families would be observed and commented on by neighbors. The wedding itself was a community-wide celebration. The procession to the church, the ceremony at the church door, and the feast afterwards were all public events. The entire village participated, reinforcing the idea that this was not just a private union, but a social contract that the community was witnessing and endorsing. This public involvement continued throughout the marriage. There was no privacy. Neighbors would know if a couple was arguing, if a husband was drinking too much, or if a wife was not managing her household well. This could be a source of support, with neighbors stepping in to help during a crisis or to mediate a dispute. But it could also be a source of immense pressure and social control. The charivari was a common and brutal form of community policing. If a couple's behavior was seen as violating the village norms, for example, if a husband was being beaten by his wife, or if an old man married a very young woman, the community might respond with a charivari. This was a noisy, public shaming ritual. Villagers would gather outside the couple's house at night, banging pots and pans, singing insulting songs, and shouting obscenities. It was a form of mob justice, designed to humiliate the offenders and force them back into line. This shows how seriously the community took its role in regulating marriage. A marriage that was seen as unnatural or disruptive was a threat to the social order, and the community would act to correct it. Adultery, too, was often punished by the community. A woman accused of adultery might be paraded through the village, forced to wear a sign or endure public insults. This was not just about punishing the individual. It was about publicly reaffirming the community's moral standards. The community's interest in the marriage was also deeply practical. A successful marriage produced children who were the next generation of laborers for the village. A failed marriage could lead to poverty and dependency, creating a burden on the community's limited resources. The village had a vested interest in ensuring that its constituent households were stable and productive. This communal nature of peasant marriage is a world away from our individualistic approach. It had its benefits: a strong social support network, a sense of belonging, and a clear set of shared values. But it also had its downsides: a complete lack of privacy, intense social pressure to conform, and the potential for brutal public shaming. For a couple like Agnes and Perrin, their love, if it existed, had to be lived within these tight constraints. It was a love that was constantly being observed, judged, and regulated by the world outside their door. It could never be a purely personal affair. It belonged, in a very real sense, to the village. This is another way in which medieval love was fundamentally different from our own. It was not about self-fulfillment or personal happiness. It was about fulfilling one's role within a larger social organism. The individual heart was subordinate to the needs of the collective. And while this might have created a strong and resilient social fabric, it did so at the cost of individual freedom and the private, personal journey of love that we have come to cherish. The double standard in adultery is one of the most glaring examples of women's status as property. Let's break down the logic behind it, which was cold, pragmatic, and entirely patriarchal. The core of the issue was not fidelity as an emotional bond, but the integrity of the male bloodline. A nobleman's entire identity, his name, his title, his land, his power, were all passed down through his legitimate heirs. His primary duty as a patriarch was to produce a son to carry on his lineage. His wife's primary function was to be the vessel for this process. A wife's adultery was therefore the ultimate act of treason against the lineage. It threatened to introduce a foreign bloodline, a cuckoo in the nest. An illegitimate child, mistaken for the true heir, could inherit everything that the family had built for generations. It was a biological and existential threat to the patriarchal order. This is why it was treated with such severity. Legally, it was a crime against the husband's property. The adulterous wife had damaged his property and stolen the use of her womb. The other man was a thief. Socially, the husband was shamed. He was a cuckold, a figure of ridicule, a man who could not control his own possessions, starting with his wife. The horns of the cuckold were a symbol of his public humiliation. The punishments were designed to be equally public and humiliating, to cleanse the community of the stain, and to serve as a terrifying warning to other women. Now consider the husband's adultery. From a purely biological and legal standpoint, it posed no threat to his own lineage. If he fathered an illegitimate child with a peasant girl or a servant, that child had no legal claim on his inheritance. The child was a bastard, outside the system of legitimate succession. His wife's womb remained pure for the production of his true heirs. His infidelity was therefore a personal sin, a matter for the confessional, but it was not a crime against the social or legal order. It did not threaten the transfer of property. It did not make his wife a cuckold. There was no female equivalent of that term, because a wife had no property in her husband's reproductive capacity. He did not belong to her in the same way that she belonged to him. This cold, property-based logic is laid bare in the legal codes of the time. The punishments are almost always asymmetrical. A man might have to pay a fine for sleeping with another man's wife. The woman herself could face mutilation or death. This double standard was not seen as unfair. It was seen as the logical consequence of the different roles and responsibilities of men and women. A man's role was to perpetuate his lineage. A woman's role was to be the faithful vehicle for that perpetuation. Her sexuality was not her own. It was a resource that belonged to her husband and his family. This is perhaps the most difficult aspect of the medieval mindset for us to grasp. We see sexuality as a core part of personal identity and expression. They saw female sexuality as a dynastic asset, a thing to be guarded, controlled, and deployed for strategic purposes. When a woman married, her sexuality was transferred from the ownership of her father to the ownership of her husband. It was a part of the dowry, an unwritten clause in the contract. To use it for her own purposes was a fundamental breach of that contract. It was theft, and in a world built on property and inheritance, theft was a very serious crime indeed. The emotional betrayal, the hurt feelings, the breach of trust, these things, which are at the core of our modern understanding of infidelity, were secondary, almost irrelevant. In the medieval legal and social framework, the primary issue was the violation of male property rights and the potential corruption of the bloodline. It is a chillingly pragmatic and deeply dehumanizing view of human relationships. The end of a tragic love story in the Middle Ages was often not just death, but a shared tomb. The posthumous reunion of the lovers' bodies was the final, perfect consummation of their doomed romance. It was a powerful symbol that granted them in death the unity they were denied in life. The tomb of Abelard and Heloise is the most famous example, but this trope was widespread. The story of Tristan and Isolde has many endings, but one of the most popular involves a briar rose and a vine growing from their separate graves, intertwining over the church, a symbol that not even stone and earth could keep their love apart. This desire for a shared final resting place speaks volumes about their worldview. It reflects a belief that the physical body, even in death, retained a kind of significance. The reunion of the bones was a tangible, physical representation of the spiritual reunion of their souls in the afterlife. It was a way of making the abstract concept of eternal love concrete. The tomb itself became a focal point for the story, a monument to the couple's tragic passion. It was a site of pilgrimage, a place where future generations of lovers could come to reflect on the ultimate romantic ideal. The tomb transformed a messy, painful story of adultery, betrayal, and suffering into a clean, elegant, and enduring work of art. It sanitized the tragedy, turning the lovers from flawed human beings into timeless icons. This process of memorialization was crucial. It allowed the society to simultaneously celebrate and condemn the lovers' transgressive passion. By giving them a beautiful tomb, the culture could acknowledge the power and beauty of their love. But by ensuring that they only found their union in death, it could also reinforce the moral that such a love has no place among the living. The tomb is both a monument and a warning. It says, "This is what great love looks like, and this is where it leads, to death." This morbid aesthetic had a profound impact on the living. It encouraged a kind of romantic necrophilia, an obsession with the trappings of death. A lover might cherish a lock of hair from his deceased beloved, or even, in more extreme stories, keep her embalmed heart in a casket. These relics were not seen as gruesome. They were seen as sacred objects, tangible links to the departed saint of love. This also helps to explain the romantic appeal of paleness and frailty. The ideal romantic heroine was often depicted as pale and delicate, as if she were already fading from the world. Her beauty was the beauty of a consumptive, a beauty on the verge of death. A healthy, rosy-cheeked, robust woman was the ideal for a peasant's wife, someone who could survive childbirth and hard labor. But the ideal for a romantic heroine was someone ethereal and doomed. Her physical fragility was a sign of her spiritual sensitivity, her unsuitability for the coarseness of the world. This cult of the beautiful death was the ultimate expression of a culture that was deeply ambivalent about life itself. If life on earth is a vale of tears, then death is a release, a homecoming. And if love on earth is a source of sin and suffering, then a love that finds its fulfillment in death is the purest love of all. It is a love that has been cleansed of all its messy, carnal, earthly imperfections. It has become an idea, a story, a perfect, unchanging monument. The shared tomb is the final page of the romance, the happily ever after of a culture that could only imagine happiness in the grave. It is a beautiful, poignant, and deeply disturbing conclusion, the logical endpoint of a worldview that found more romance in an epitaph than in a life. Let's pause for a moment and consider the sounds of the medieval world and how they would have shaped the experience of love and secrecy. Our world is saturated with constant, low-level noise. The hum of refrigerators, the drone of traffic, the electronic chatter of our devices. Their world was different. It was a world of intense, quiet, and sudden, sharp sounds. At night, in the countryside, the silence would have been absolute, broken only by the cry of an owl or the rustle of wind in the trees. In a castle or a town, the silence of the night would be punctuated by the ringing of the church bell for the monastic hours, the cry of the night watchman, or the barking of a dog. This landscape of sound made secrecy both easier and harder. The darkness and quiet of night could provide cover for a secret meeting, a whispered conversation in a dark corner of a garden. But any sound you made would travel. A creaking floorboard, a dislodged stone, a nervous cough. These small sounds would be amplified by the surrounding silence, broadcasting your presence to anyone who might be listening. This made illicit love affairs a high-stakes game of stealth. The lovers in the romances are constantly worried about being overheard. They speak in whispers. They arrange their meetings through trusted intermediaries. They use codes and signals. The story of Pyramus and Thisbe, a classical tale that was very popular in the Middle Ages, is all about two lovers who can only communicate through a crack in a wall that separates their houses. Their love is a thing of whispers and shadows, constantly threatened by discovery. The sounds of the day were primarily human and animal. The dominant sound in a village was the rhythm of agricultural work, the grunt of an ox, the swish of a scythe, the thud of an axe. In a town, it was the sound of crafts, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the rattle of the weaver's loom, the cry of the street vendor. These sounds were the soundtrack of daily life, a constant reminder of the world of work and commerce. Romantic love, with its focus on leisure and emotion, existed outside this soundscape. It was associated with a different set of sounds: the soft strumming of a lute, the singing of a love poem, the quiet murmur of conversation in a private chamber. These were the sounds of the elite, the sounds of a world that had time for such things. For most people, the sound of love was probably much simpler: the sound of a shared laugh over a meal, the cry of a newborn child, the quiet breathing of a partner sleeping beside you. These were the unrecorded, domestic sounds of affection. But the dominant public sound associated with love, at least in the aristocratic world, was the sound of violence. The thunder of hooves at a tournament, the crash of lance on shield, the shouts of the combatants, the roar of the crowd. This was the loudest, most spectacular music of love. It was a declaration of passion that was designed to be heard, to be impossible to ignore. This contrast between the quiet, secret sounds of intimacy and the loud, public sounds of romantic violence is telling. It suggests a world where genuine connection had to be hidden, while the aggressive performance of love was celebrated. It was a world that was more comfortable with the clang of a sword than with a whispered confession of the heart. The very acoustics of their world, the deep silence and the sudden, sharp noises, reinforced this dynamic. It was a world of high contrast, with little middle ground. Love was either a secret whisper or a public roar. The idea of a calm, steady, conversational love, a love that exists in the comfortable, middle-volume range of daily life, was a sound that their world was not yet ready to hear. As we draw this long journey to a close, let's reflect on the profound gap between their reality and our fantasy. The medieval period has become a kind of cultural attic for our romantic imaginations. It is a dusty, dimly lit space where we store our fantasies of chivalry, courtly love, and happily ever after. We climb up into that attic whenever we want to escape our own complex, messy, modern world. We rummage through the old chests and find the glittering stories of knights and princesses, and we hold them up as something pure and simple. But we have been exploring what was really in that attic. And alongside the beautiful, embroidered tapestries of the romances, we have found the cold, hard objects of reality. the marriage contracts that read like business mergers, the penitential manuals that cataloged sins of the flesh, the legal texts that defined a woman as property, the medical treatises that diagnosed love as a fatal disease. The fantasy is seductive, but the reality was brutal. The love that they celebrated was often, to our eyes, a pathology. It was a love that found nobility in unrequited suffering, romance in violence, and its ultimate perfection in death. The love that we value, a love based on partnership, equality, communication, and mutual happiness, was a concept that was either non-existent or actively suppressed. It was too individualistic, too chaotic, too dangerous for a world built on rigid hierarchies of power. To be disgusted by medieval love is, in a way, a sign of our own historical progress. It is a measure of how far we have come. Our disgust is the product of centuries of slow, painful change. The rise of humanism, the Enlightenment's focus on individual rights, the feminist struggle for equality, the psychological revolutions that have taught us to value our emotional lives. We stand on the shoulders of these changes, and from this vantage point, we look back at the past and we shudder. But our journey tonight was not just about judging the past. It was about understanding it. It was about trying to inhabit, for a little while, a mindset that is profoundly alien to our own. It was about seeing that the people of the Middle Ages were not monsters, but human beings, living within a framework of beliefs and social structures that shaped their feelings and their choices in ways that are hard for us to imagine. Their world was a cage in many ways. A cage of duty, a cage of piety, a cage of violence. And they sought love, as all humans do, but they had to do so within the bars of that cage. Their solutions were often strange, contorted, and unhealthy. They learned to call the bars of the cage beautiful. They wrote poems to the lock on the door. They fell in love with the shadow of the key. As you settle into the comfort of your own bed, in your own world, let the weight of that strange past settle. It is not your past. It is a foreign country. You have the freedom to love who you choose, to build a life on your own terms, to believe that love should be a source of strength and joy. These freedoms are not trivial. They are the precious, hard-won inheritance of a long and difficult history. Let the stories of Guilhem and Isabel, of Robert and Eleanor, of Abelard and Heloise fade into the quiet of the night. Their struggles are over. Their world of beautiful suffering has dissolved into dust. And in its place is your world, a world where love, we hope, can be a little less disgusting, a little more kind, a world where the heart does not have to be a battlefield, but can, if we are lucky, be a home. Sleep well.